Do you need a translation?
But I know the question.
Okay.
The first question about the situation.
Yes.
And the second question about the solution.
Yes. Okay. I know. Okay. Good morning, everyone. Thank you all for showing up and being the dedicated early risers. I hope you've all had your tea and coffee and are ready for another day of interesting panels. I'm very honored today to be able to speak about human rights and climate change and its effect in Iraq. I've got a wonderful panel with me comprising members of civil society, government, experts that are going to share their expertise with you. Often when we think about climate change, we think about it as an issue in and of itself. And I've had actually a couple of people ask me what are the links between human rights and climate change. But the thing is that climate change affects a wide range of rights, everything from the right to water, the right to health, to housing, security and stability. So hopefully the panelists today are going to walk us through what some of the impacts we're seeing already are in Iraq related to climate change. And I will try to have us take a more positive tone as we conclude with solutions and things that we can do looking forward. So first up, I'm going to introduce Mr. Jassim Al-Asadi, who is the founder and head of Nature Iraq, a wonderful organization that has been very active, especially in the southern marshes. The southern marshes have seen quite dramatic impacts of both climate change and environmental degradation. Could you maybe start by walking us through some of the impacts that you've been seeing in the southern marshes and how that's affecting people's lives there?
Yes. السلام عليكم جميعا. أهوار جنوب العراق بدءا خلينا نعرف هي أهوار مهمة وأهوار تاريخية. هي ثلاثة أهوار رئيسية إضافة للأهوار الصغيرة. مجموع مساحة الأهوار الثلاثة تاريخياً يقرب معدلها من 9650 كيلومتر مربع وتصل في مواسم الفيضانات إلى أكثر من 20,000 كيلومتر مربع. فهي بمساحة بلد كلبنان وأكبر من مساحة 27 بلد في العالم. فيها تنوع أحيائي وفيها استيطان بشري. جذوره في القدم غارقة جدا، جذور سومرية، ثم أكثر من 270 مفردة يتكلمها السكان المحليون، وهي مفردات سومرية أكدية آرامية ليست عربية، كما أن السلوك والعادات هي سلوكيات سومرية في كثير من أجزائها. لكن هذا الهور مثل ما تعرفون تعرض إلى إبادة جماعية وتعرض إلى تجفيف مريع ما بين عام 1991 حتى عام 2003، وأصبحت منطقة الأهوار أشبه بالصحراء. فبدلاً من القصب والبردي والتنوع الأحيائي الهائل للنباتات الغاطسة والطافية والأسماك وكليب الماء ذو الفراء الناعم ماكسويلي وهازجة قصب البصرة، أصبحت هنالك أشجار الطرفة والحيوانات البرية كالذئاب وابن آوى وغيره. وهاجر السكان المحليون إلى بقاع الأرض المختلفة إلى غرب العراق وإلى بقية أنحاء العالم. فلدينا جالية من مربي الجاموس التي كانت لا تقرأ ولا لا تكتب باللغة العربية، اليوم تتحدث باللغة الإنجليزية في مدينة مثل ديترويت، وكذلك في هولندا والسويد، وجالية كبيرة في استراليا في سيدني على وجه التحديد. عادت الأهوار تباعاً بعد عام 2003 ولم يكن للحكومة العراقية يد في عودتها، يعني ليست هنالك خطة لاستعادة الأهوار لا للحكومة المركزية ولا للحكومات المحلية، إنما السكان المحليون عند سقوط النظام كسروا السداد القامعة للمياه واستعادت الهور هذا كما ترون في الصورة الأهوار الوسطى، ومن ثم عاد السكان المحليون تباعاً. فمدينة مثل تشبايش كانت عند عام 1990 قبل الإغمار عدد نفوسها يصل إلى 63,000 نسمة، وجلهم يعتمد على اقتصاديات المياه، أعني تربية الجاموس، صيد الأسماك، قص الحشيش والقصب، صناعة المضائف وصناعة الماتس. بقى منها عام 2002 حوالي 6000 نسمة فقط. اليوم استعادت المنطقة هويتها السكانية مرة أخرى وارتفع عدد السكان إلى 61,000 نسمة. عندما استعيدت الأهوار من قبل السكان المحليين كانت مناسيب المياه عالية في دجلة والفرات، يعني هي ليست وفرة لكنها بحدود ممكنة للإغمار، وتم إغمار الأهوار. لم يكن هنالك خطة لاستعادة ما هي المساحة التي يمكن استعادتها من الأهوار. لكن في ديسمبر من عام 2003 تم إنشاء مركز الكريم اللي هو Center for Restoration the Iraq's Marshes and Wetland. وفي عام 2005 وضع المركز خطة لاستعادة 5600 كيلو متر مربع من الأهوار، توزعت على الأهوار الرئيسية الثلاث: هور الحمار الغربي، الأهوار الوسطى، هور الحويزة، وهو الهور اللي شاركنا الجارة إيران فيه. لكن إذا نباوع للنظام الهيدرولوجي وتوزيعات المياه في هذه الأهوار من عام 2003 حتى عام 2025 نشوف احنا لم نستطيع أن نحقق الهدف، سواء في عام 2019 ثم وفرة بالمياه تجاوزت 65 مليار متر مكعب في سدودنا الرئيسية الثلاثة اللي هو الموصل، حديثة، دوكان، وكذلك بحيرة الثرثار، ووصل إغمار الهور إلى حدود 97%. أما ما بعد ذلك فهي النسبة تتراوح من 8% إلى 70%. صادفنا مشكلة ما بعد الإغمار، هو مشكلة الجفاف. يعني كان تسعينات القرن الماضي سياسة تجفيف، لكن الجفاف لحقنا في عام 2009 وتكرر مرة أخرى في عام 2015، تكرر بعدها في عام 2018، لكن في كل مرة يتكرر الجفاف كانت وراها سنة رطبة إلى حدود ما ونستعيد الهور مرة أخرى. لكن الجفاف الأشد قسوة هو الجفاف الذي ابتدأ نهاية عام 2020 واستمر لغاية اليوم، لغاية عام 2025. هو جفاف مريع. خسرنا حوالي 30% من قطعان الجاموس، وخسرنا أكثر من 95% من الخزين السمكي للأهوار، ناهيك عن تنوع أحيائي هائل خسرنا بالأهوار العراقية. للمناسبة الأهوار أدخلت على لائحة التراث العالمي عام 2016، وأدخلت لوجود التنوع الأحيائي الهائل ولوجود كثير من النباتات والحيوانات والطيور الموجودة على لائحة الحمراء، لائحة الخطر العالمية. وهذه من ضمنها هازجة قصب البصرة على سبيل المثال، التي تزور الأهوار في فترات الصيف قادمة من جنوب أفريقيا، أو ماكسويلي المقيم، هذا الحيوان الذي اكتشفه العالم في عام 1956 بعد أن كان لا يعرف عنه شيئا. اليوم أيضا احنا دا نخسر الماكسويلي مرة أخرى، ودا نخسر هازجة قصب البصرة، ودا نخسر أيضا عدد كبير من السكان المحليين نتيجة الهجرة. للمناسبة السكن داخل الأهوار يتعرض إلى مخاطر. المخاطر تتمثل في وفرة المياه وفي نوعية المياه. عندما تصعد الملوحة إلى أكثر من 6000 جزء بالمليون لا يستطيع مربي الجاموس أن يبقى في الأهوار، عليه أن يغير مكانه باستمرار. وعندما تنحسر المياه كثيراً أيضاً لا وجود للمراعي الخضراء، فهنالك تغير في الاستيطان، تغير في المكان داخل الهور الواحد. يعني ممكن أن نشوف مربي الجاموس ينتقل ل3 أو 4 مرات في السنة الواحدة من منطقة في الهور إلى منطقة أخرى في الهور، أو من هور إلى هور آخر، كأن ينتقل من هور الحمار الغربي إلى الأهوار الوسطى أو بالعكس. أو هنالك هجرة خارج الهور، وهذه الهجرة الأخطر، يعني أن يطلعون من الأهوار بشكل كامل إلى مناطق أخرى، على سبيل المثال إلى الكوت أو إلى كربلاء وإلى بابل والنجف، حيث توجد قنوات مياه أو قنوات بزل، ويجلسون هنالك بعد أن خسروا جزء من جاموسهم نتيجة الموت، أو جزء من جاموسهم لأنهم لا يستطيعون أن يبقوا على قيد الحياة إلا أن يبيعوا الجاموس لكي يستطيعوا التنقل وتكوين سكن جديد. إلى آخره. طبعا هذا راح تعرضنا لمخاطر ومخاطر كبيرة. اليوم الأهوار ما نقول جافة، نقول عادت قليلا عن العام الماضي، عن مستويات العام الماضي. فدا أعطيكم مثال على التغير اللي صار بالهور نتيجة التغير اللي صار في مناسيب المياه. على سبيل المثال في عام 2019 منسوب الفرات بالشبايش، وهي المنطقة المحورية لتوزيع الماء إلى كل من هور الحمار الغربي والأهوار الوسطى، كان المنسوب 194 سنتيمتر. في 12/12/2023 هبط هذا المنسوب في نفس النقطة إلى 28 سنتيمتر فقط، وهو أوطأ منسوب في تاريخ الفرات. اليوم وأنا جاي من الشبايش من منطقة الهور، المنسوب في تلك النقطة 90 سنتيمتر. ليس منسوباً عالياً، وليس منسوباً يفترض أن يواجه الصيف القادم، لأن أمامنا تبخر وتبخر هائل. نسبة التبخر في الأهوار تقارب 2.8 متر سنوياً. هذا يعني علينا أن نطلق مزيد من المياه للأهوار. الذي أريد أن أقول أيضاً أن الأهوار حين وضعناها في الخطة في عام 2005 تم حساب كمية المياه اللازمة للأهوار، فوجدنا أن الأهوار تحتاج لكمية تقارب 5.4 مليار متر مكعب سنوياً كحد أدنى لإدامة نصف المساحة المطلوبة بالهدف. أما نصف المساحة الأخرى فيمكن تغطيتها بمصادر مياه أخرى بعد المعالجة، كمياه الصرف الصحي على سبيل المثال. مياه المصب العام، وهو قناة ناقلة للمياه المالحة من شمال بغداد من الصقلاوية حتى الخليج، وهو يطلق كميات مياه هائلة، يعني مصممين أن يطلق 200 متر مكعب بالثانية. كذلك الحال بمبزل شرق الغراف أو مبزل شرق العمارة إلى آخره. بكل الأحوال اللي صار إحنا ما قدرنا من 20 سنة لليوم أن نستفاد من المياه العادمة، المياه الرمادية، مياه الصرف الصحي إلى آخره، ناهيك عن التلوث الحادث بالهور. اليوم هنالك تلوث وتلوث كبير، يعني أكثر من 40 محطة مجاري تصب في الفرات أو دجلة مباشرة أو تصب بالأهوار بشكل مباشر. يعني مياه الصرف الصحي تجينا عن طريق النهرين العظيمين أو تجينا بشكل مباشر الأهوار العراقية، وما قدرنا لليوم أن نشتغل ما يسمى بالفايتو تكنولوجي بروجكت، يعني تنقية طبيعية هي محاكاة للطبيعة. ناخذ مياه الصرف الصحي ونمررها على نباتات مزروعة بشكل هندسي بموجب فلو محسوب، وبالنتيجة تطلع لنا مياه صالحة. وتجربة مصر يمكن خير تجربة في تصفية مياه الصرف الصحي في بحيرة المنزلة، والمصريين طبعاً يستفادون من مي، مو لأنه عندهم هور، لكنهم يستفادون به للمزروعات لزراعة الخضروات.
شكراً.
شكراً.
شكراً. Thank you very much for that. It was a very clear picture of what we're seeing. And, you know, clearly the water issue is something that's having a lot of effects in the south. With that, I would like to turn to our second panelist, who is a lawyer and an expert in water issues and mediation particularly. Dr. Shubar, could you maybe walk us through what the future of water availability and scarcity look like in Iraq? What are some of the implications of increased water scarcity in Iraq, particularly vis-a-vis its relations with its neighbors and the effects that will have on human rights?
Thank you for having me on this distinguished panel. And I also want to thank our first panelist, Jassim, because he's illustrated already many of the points I'm going to make. But I want to start with two short observations about the connection between water and climate change. First, I want to make a connection with the title of this event, because what climate change does is to introduce uncertainty in relation to water availability. It's disrupting an already complicated issue when it comes to water resources management. As many of you know, it's already considered a wicked problem a problem that is very difficult to solve, if not impossible. And climate change is adding much disruption, my second point. And I think that disruption is both a challenge, but also an opportunity to think about how we use water. It's when we're faced with a crisis that we realize our dependency on it. We use water not just for drinking, but for food production, for energy production, for industrial purposes. The mobile phones that all of you have necessitated the use of water for their production. The clothes we wear, everything, in fact, uses water in some way or the other. Our challenge already today is that we don't always have enough water to satisfy those needs, to satisfy the way in which water is consumed to produce what I've mentioned. So we already see competition between users at all levels, from communal to national to international. If we turn now to the effects of climate change here in Iraq, I want to highlight two key factors. Coming back to the notion of uncertainty, it's the unpredictability of water availability. Climate change no longer allows us to model and forecast how much water is going to be available. We have erratic precipitation patterns, so rainfall comes at different times, in different quantities, in different places, and the same applies to snowfall. And we have temperature increase as well, which is affecting the region, which is affecting the entire globe. We read on a daily basis about glaciers melting in Asia, in Europe, and so forth. And together, these two factors have three effects. They decrease river discharge, so there's less water available in the rivers, in the Tigris and the Euphrates. They cause extreme weather events, so ranging from prolonged droughts, as have been experienced already in the region, to extreme floods. Very heavy rainfalls, storms, are another expression of those two factors. And then finally, sea level rise as well, which has an impact in the south of the country, increasing salinity in the water, damaging as well the quality of the land. And if we look at these three effects, we can think of the impact that they're having on water availability. A resource that is already scarce becomes even more scarce. Less water is accessible for the different users that I've just highlighted. And that affects not just water for domestic purposes, but water for agriculture. As we know, on average, agriculture consumes about 70% of all water worldwide. I think the percentage here is slightly higher. And when there is less water available, whether it's because of decreased rainfall, which is affecting the northern provinces where agriculture relies on rainfall, or the provinces where agriculture relies on irrigation, this is affecting livelihoods, the livelihoods of the farmers. It's affecting food production. It's affecting food security as well. And of course, it has an immense impact on the environment. The environment, we forget that it's one of the major users of water as well. Jassim has already illustrated how it's affecting the marshes. We see, in addition to the impact on the livelihoods of the communities that live there, that rely on fishing, that rely on agriculture, we see environmental degradation, we see biodiversity being affected. So another human right here, the right to a healthy environment, is impacted. What are the implications of all of these effects? Well, in the first instance, we see that when it comes to water resources management, which is already complicated, it's even more complicated than it was. Planning becomes challenging because we plan for a certain amount of water to be available, but we don't know if it's going to be there. So at some point in time, if the conditions change, there is a need to adjust and to change the initial plan. And that has an impact domestically, obviously, but it's also an international matter. When water is coming from other regions, from other countries, into a third country, in the way that the Tigris and the Euphrates flow from Turkey through Syria into Iraq. These effects are being felt in those other countries. They're also taking measures to address them. And in the absence of coordination, there are question marks as how you can deal with the situation in each of the countries. What it does also, when there is less water available, is that it forces us to prioritize. Who is going to get the water? Of course, water for drinking, for humans, is a priority. We've already heard about the human right to water. That comes top. But after that, how much water for the marshes? How much water for agriculture? How much water for other purposes that we don't see immediately, but are also there? These are difficult and sensitive questions to be asked. In the case of a prolonged drought, those who have lost their livelihoods because they don't have access to water, how do we support them? What alternatives can we bring? It's a lot of questions. I don't have all the answers, but these are really important questions, and I'll end here with two challenges, but also an opportunity. I think uncertainty is certainly an immense challenge because of the impacts on water availability that I've just outlined. It's also a challenge because of the international dimension. Everything that I explained is affecting the countries in the region, the riparians of the two rivers and of the other rivers in the region and globally. We see that other parts of the world are being affected at the moment. You may or may not know that Switzerland and France are negotiating over the Rhone River that they share. There is no agreement at the moment, and France wants assurances about how much water it's going to get from Switzerland for agricultural production and in order to operate the nuclear power plants that are downstream of Lake Geneva. So this is an international matter, a matter of concern. But at the same time, I would want to hope that it's an opportunity to think about how we use water individually, as a community, nationally and internationally. Because the unpredictability that I highlighted, we have no control over it. And so all of us will be affected in different ways, but affected by something that we can't control. And this is an opportunity to come together and to do something. And my final point is something I was explaining to someone yesterday. When we talk about water, everyone will say how important it is, how we need to value it, how we need to respect it. But when it comes to taking action, it's often more complicated. When it comes to putting money into projects, into the measures that we need to address uncertainty and all the other issues that affect water, because it's a factor that comes amongst many other factors that are already affecting water, and uncertainty also affects the demand for water, not just the supply of water. But we have to go beyond talking about it. We have to go beyond saying that we'll do something and actually do something and put the financing that's needed. And I'll end here.
Thank you. I think you raised some very interesting issues and concerns, and I look forward to hearing from Dr. Mufti a little while later about how the government is thinking about these concerns. Before I turn to you, Dr. Mufti, I would just like to ask our panelist at the end, Ms. Sherry Kram Talabani. So far we've gotten a good overview of some of the issues and the ways that they're impacting people. But we also know that climate change already is and is expected to disproportionately impact certain groups, particularly those in society who are already among the most vulnerable, like women and girls. Could you maybe speak to some of the specific effects that climate change is having on women and girls in Iraq and how they're feeling and experiencing climate change so far?
Thank you, Sarah. Can you hear me? Is it working? As you said, we've already seen profound and very specific impacts to women and girls because it's exacerbating existing inequalities, creating new challenges, and we see that both the vulnerabilities and the impacts are both intersecting and compounding their building. So I'll talk about the 5 ways that we see most prominently impacting women and girls. First, women and girls are at greater risk of harm during disasters. Women and girls are 14 times more likely to be harmed during an environmental disaster. At least 60% of deaths in an environmentally related extreme climate event are women. In countries like Iraq, women and girls already have a lower capacity to cope with such events, less access to the resources they need to respond, insufficient access to information and early warnings. So women are heavily impacted in disasters. Second, we see that women and girls have increased vulnerability to displacement and increased impacts while in displacement. So when we heard about the environmental degradation, such as the extreme temperatures and water scarcity, it's led to displacement in areas like southern Iraq, as Mr. Jassim said. Displaced populations are generally already disproportionately impacted by storms, by flooding, by drought, and women and girls face heightened risks while in displacement, less access to livelihoods, increased exposure to violence. That's the third area, which is what we see in climate-related events and displacement. We see heightened risk of gender-based violence. So these climate-induced stressors, which can also be economic, displacement, water scarcity, have been directly linked already to a rise in violence against women and girls. And in some context, families, especially here in Iraq, resort to negative coping mechanisms such as early marriage, forced marriage. And these are used to address the economic disparities, the economic tensions that are exacerbated by climate change. Fourth, there are huge barriers to accessing sexual and reproductive health services. So climate-related events already disrupt healthcare infrastructure for everybody. And this can limit access to services for women and girls, which impacts increased rates of maternal mortality, infant mortality, unintended pregnancies, and untreated reproductive health issues. Finally, this exacerbates the inequality of the economic situation. So we already heard about how this impacts agriculture and water scarcity, water resources. Women often rely on these sectors, experience greater economic hardship. The financial strain also impacts their access to education and healthcare and other critical services. So women in Iraq or girls in Iraq, we only see 5 out of 10 women graduating from secondary education. So this dynamic is exacerbated by all of these other factors, these social inequities and economic inequities. And so they also translate into women having fewer assets, which allow them to deal with the negative impacts of climate. So I'll close by telling you a story about our client Fadia. So Fadia was a Yazidi woman in Sinjar who was with a group of other women in her family doing household chores when ISIS came. Her husband was with the men of the family and had the family car, and he and the men were able to escape and come to Kurdistan. But the women were taken as captives, and she was exposed to brutal sexual and other forms of torture, sexual violence. When Fadia was rescued years later, she returned to her family in a displacement camp for Yazidi survivors here in Kurdistan. She struggled with providing for her children access to water, access to food, access to livelihoods, or any education to finish her education. Unfortunately, Fadia had no influence over the decisions of her family and argued with her husband a lot about leaving the displacement camp to return to Sinjar. She was exposed to numerous floods and fires in the camp. Her daughter, was exposed to waterborne diseases because of the constant exposure to the water inside their tent. And so this is the situation that Fadia remains in today in a displacement camp in Kurdistan-Iraq, exposed to a range of challenges, lack of access to healthcare resources, lack of access to work and jobs, and having a very low impact on the ability to make decisions about her future and to mitigate the consequences of her displacement. So I think what we see here in Iraq, as in other places that are affected by climate, that these impacts disproportionately impact women and girls, particularly in rural and conflict-affected areas where they face food insecurity, water scarcity, displacement, violence, and a lack of access to both services and protection.
Thank you. And I want to thank you again, especially for sharing that human story with us. I think it's really important to remember, especially in forums like this, where we often talk at very high levels, that these are lived things that have very real impacts on people's lives. Of course, so Sherry, you are the co-founder and the head of the SEED organization. So you, like myself, as members of the NGO world, are painfully aware that changes that are happening in funding, particularly with the cutting of USAID and other states reducing their foreign assistance budgets, has meant that the money for these kinds of activities has been rapidly shrinking. Do you have any sorts of recommendations or advice to either policymakers or organizations seeking to do programming around climate to ensure that they're taking into account the specific needs of women and girls?
Sure, of course. Thank you. So I believe that women need to be in the places where decisions are made, because women are greatly impacted by these climate-related disasters, and women are best inclined to be able to represent the needs of families and communities. And we know that when women participate in policy making or decision making, whether it's in the home or it's in the parliament or it's in government, that the outcomes are better for all of society, not just for women and girls. So it's really important for, especially in this resource-constrained time where governments are pulling back, that we continue to focus on how to empower women to be capacitated to contribute to decision-making, contribute to policy-making, that women's voices are part of the process, and that we consult with women about these impacts and how to mitigate these impacts. And we can also support local mechanisms. So here in the Kurdistan region, we have this GBV Sector Coordination Group, which SEED co-leads as a local coordinating mechanism. Here with MOLSA, the Ministry of Labor and Social Affairs, we coordinate among 80 government agents, 80 organizations and government agencies that are all focused on the protection of women and girls. And these are the kinds of mechanisms that need to be fostered and supported so that we can continue to do our work to ensure that women's needs and girls' needs are addressed here in Kurdistan. So I think it's critically important as international donors are pulling away, that we together identify this priority to support local mechanisms, to support local decision-making, local services, locally led coordination. And I think there's never been a more critical moment to focus on the long-term investments in Kurdistan's capacity to manage these climate-related impacts.
Thank you. I think you're totally right, and I think that provides a perfect segue to Dr. Turhan, who is the advisor to the Prime Minister on Water Affairs. He has a very rich background and a lot of expertise that he's able to bring both to us and also to the Iraqi government. Could you maybe walk us through some of the steps that the government has been taking to address the issues, particularly of water, since that's your expertise, but other climate issues? And I would especially like, in light of Sherry's intervention, I'd especially like to hear any efforts that the government has taken to ensure that the needs of women and girls are thought of and included in this programming.
Thank you. Before I talk about what we are doing in order to be face-to-face with the water situation, I will talk about some answering about what our colleagues said. Do you know, the water budget in Iraq, if we have good season, that means we will need about 90 billion cubic meter per year. In drought or in poor season, we will have about 50 billion. So always Iraq used to be between this range year after year. But what happened in Iraq start now, it's not isolated from our region or from the world for the climate change. There is now climate change. We record some changes about that. For example, we used to have about, let me say, about 15 years ago, 1 year rainfall with good rainfall, 1 year in poor rainfall. After that, it started to be 1 for 2, 1 for 3. This year, we have 1 for 4. That means 1 year rainy and 4 year almost poor in rainfall or close to be drought. By this kind of case or modeling, that means we still not in drought period, we are in poor period, but we are just a step before to go in the drought period. The other thing about Iraq, our water budget or our water supply, about 75% it used to come to Iraq from our neighborhood. And by this mean, about just 20 to 25% we have inside in Iraq. I am talking about surface water, not about undersurface. The main problem of Iraq in the water supply, because as I said, about 75% it used to come out of Iraq, there is no agreement for Iraq and his neighborhood. There is kind memorandum of understanding, MOU, there is kind another understanding, but there is no fixed agreement. Our neighborhood, they believe they are upstream and we are downstream. They don't believe or agree we are riparian countries or we are coastal countries. And in this kind of situation, there is different in definition about what we have of the water. If we are riparian countries or coastal countries, that means Iraq has right to say, okay, I need just in this camp and this amount of percentage. But when we are downstream and our neighborhood, they are upstream, that means they can use and they can take what they want and the rest of they don't want it, they can push it in Iraq. And this, it is not new, it's from century. It's just, we start this kind of conversation with our neighborhood from 40th, just before 8 years ago. And the other point happened because of we are, there is not this kind of understanding. If we back for 70 years ago, the percentage between the people or the citizens who live in the cities and the people who used to live in the village, it was about 1 to 3 used to the city and 2 of the 3 used to village. According to the last statistical national census before a few months ago, it's start completely to be upside down now. We have about almost 70% from our citizens living or trying to live in the cities and the big cities, and the other still live in the village. That will create for the government or even for the next government kind of social conflict to find job opportunity, to find the good services for these big cities. In this kind of atmosphere, what we start to do, and because of there is, as I told before, there is no clear or fixed agreement between Iraq and his neighborhood, we try to think something, let me say, out of the box. So now we have a kind of MOU with Turkey, especially because our 70% of water supply come to Iraq from Turkey. Kind of MOU, it's, let me say, it's water supply / economic. By this kind of MOU, we start dealing with this issue, and it is successful. We start that just before almost less than 1 year, and now what we have or what we get now from water supply is almost more than double what we had in 23. In 24, for example, from what we came by river, the Tigris River, it is double after we start working in this kind of MOU. Maybe we were thinking to make the same MOU with the other neighborhood, for example, with Iran, although with Iran, it's about 13% from water supply coming from Iran. But this kind of MOU, it's really successful for Iraq, but that doesn't mean we have no needs for the water supply. One of the points that my colleague talked is about the marshes. The marshes taking about 10 to 15% for the water reserves of surface water reserve of Iraq, and we have evaporation percentage from 6 to 8 billion cubic meter per year. It's a huge number. That's mean almost about the dam of Haditha. All that lake could be evaporated if we're talking about the whole of the Iraq. And that's because Iraq is one of the 15 countries suffered with the climate change. By this kind of atmosphere we're dealing now, we brought to Iraq, and we encourage the farmers to use a new kind or new technology for agriculture, even for rice, because rice taking a huge amount of water. And we start to, what we called it in Arabic, hasidat al-miyah, water hunts, small dams in order to reserve the water in desert area and in some other areas. And again, with this kind of MOU, we're keeping our water need in safe until now. But what we need in Iraq, really, we need to create kind of culture to how to use this kind of water. It is not, again, it's not just isolated by Iraq. The whole world has climate change now. So we should start new kind of agriculture and new kind of culture to each people, to each citizen in Iraq, how to use and how to know how much this water is variable and it is big value for Iraq. The last point what I want to say, when we're talking about the treatment and retreatment of water, for the leaching water especially, because it's about 10 to 15% for the water supply is used to going to the domestical using. So we have about 80 to 85% for the agriculture use. One of the output of the agriculture use of the leaching water, and what we call it in Arabic, miyah al-bazl. This amount of water, if we treat it or retreat it, that doesn't mean we will have value add in our water supply, because already this leaching water inside the budget of the water budget. So we will change the quality of the water. We will not add another value or another amount for the water if we calculate the leaching water. Thank you.
Thank you. We've got a few minutes left, so I'd just like to reiterate my question. If there's anything that you're particularly proud of that the government has done, and any ways that the government is taking into account the specific needs of women and girls when designing water policies.
Yeah, as I mentioned before, one of the good points that we did is that we signed the MOU with Turkey, and I said it is, let me say, it's about water supply / economic, and it's going well. What now, if we make comparison between what we have in our dams and make comparison from the past year, it is very good. It's about double. It's not enough, but it is double, so it is good. And we start encourage the farmers to use new technology for agriculture. And again, I will repeat, we need to create culture for each citizen, how this water is variable, how it's big value for each one. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you so much. With that, we are just about out of time. I hope you join me in thanking our very expert panelists, and I hope you all learned something, as I know I did. Thank you very much. I was told no questions. Huh? I was told not to, but I mean, they told me it finishes at 9:20. It's only 50 minutes, yeah. Okay, go ahead. We've been given more time, so please go ahead.
زۆر سپاس بە کوردی قساکەم هیوادارم ئەنی گۆڕینەکە باش بیت بۆ بەتایبەتی بۆ زمانی عەرەبی. من چەند پرسیارێکم هەیە لە بەڕێز دکتۆر تۆرهان موفتی وە سەرنجێشمێ بۆ خات و تاڵەبانی. کاک تۆرهان، بەڕێز تۆرهان، من چاوەڕێمە کرد تۆشتی باشترت پێ بێت. من لێرەنا بە جەناب دەڵێم کە لە عێراقدا سیاسەتێکی ئاوی پێشکەوتوو نییە و ئەو بەڕێزت شانازی بە و ئەوەی کە پێ دەڵێ مزەکەرەی تەفاهومەکەی لە نێوان ئێران و لەگەڵ عێراق لەگەڵ تورکیا لە ڕاستیدا ئەوە شتێکی وانییە و عێراق تەواو تەسلیم بە دەوڵەتی ئێران و سیاسەتەکانی بووە ئەجینا ئەتوانی پێی بڵێ و یعنی پەیوەندی نێوان دەوڵەتی عێراق و دەوڵەتی ئێران زۆرە و هەروەها لەگەڵ تورکیاش بە هەمان شێوە. بەڵام لەوە زیاتر یعنی بەڕاستی ئەوەی کە دەوڵەتی عێراق بەرامبەر هەرێمی کوردستانەکە، هەرێمی کوردستان سەرباری قەیرانی دارایی، سەرباری ئابلۆقەی خنچێنەری دەوڵەتی بەڕێستان، سیر کە نزیکەی لە 55 بەنداو و پۆند لە نێوان بەندا و پۆندی بچووک و مامناوەند دروست کراوە و لە بواری دروستکردندایە. بە جەناب دەڵێم عێراق چی کردووە لەو بەنداوانە؟ ئەو بوحەیرانەش کە هەیە حەدیسە و چی پێڵێن سەرسار و ئانە زۆربەی ئەبن بە هەڵم زۆربەی ئەو بەندا و ئەو پۆندانەی کە هەیە هەمووی سەردەمی سیستەمی پاشایەتی عێراقە. تەنها بەنداوی سەدام نەبی کە ناویان لێنا مووسڵ ئەو نەبێ کە ئەویش بەخۆت جەناب تەزانی کێشەی زۆر قوڵی بنیادی هەیە. یعنی بەڕاستی نازانم دەوڵەتی بەڕێستان بۆوە خەمسار دەبرامبەر بە سیاسەتی ئاو وە بۆ مەسەلەی مافی مرۆڤی کە بەستراوەتەوە بە ئاو بەڕاستی بەوە نییە کە ڕۆشنبیری بدێ خەڵک، بەوەیە لە گوندەکانی باشووری عێراق بتوانن یعنی ژیانێکی وا دروستکەن کە خەڵک بمینتەوە کە تۆ قوتابخانەی بۆ دروست نەکەی لە ناو کابینەیەک قوتابخانەی بۆ دروستکەی کە هاوکاری کۆمەڵایەتی نەبێ چۆن خەڵک لە گوند دەمێنتەوە ئەڕوا بەرەو شار. ئەوە ڕەخنەیەکە لە جەنابتان لەبەرەوەی جەنابتان ڕاوێژکاری سەرۆکی حکوومەتی عێراقی حکوومەتی فیدرالی بۆیە نازانم هەستەکەم يعني حكومتي عراقي هي سياسة چینیە و تەواو خۆی ڕادەستی ئێران و تورکیا کردووە و ئەتوانێت جەناب دەڵێ 125 ئاوی هەیە لە ناو خۆی
ببورە
ئەو بەڵێ ببورە
کات تەواو بووە پرسیار نەکرد ئەوە 5 دقە زیاترە بەس تحلیلەکەی
پرسیارم کرد
تەواو زۆر سپاس دەکەم چونکە ئەسڵەن تەواو بووە کاتەکە مەمنونتم.
I prefer to answer in Arabic. راح أجاوب بالعربي. أي الموضوع هي مو موضوع استسلام من عدم استسلام، بالعكس هي استخدام الملف الاقتصادي أمام توريد المياه. سابقا قبل هذه الحكومة الدول المجاورة هم مستفادين اقتصاديا بالعراق، بالمقابل لم يتم استخدام الملف الاقتصادي كأداة لاستجلاب المياه. فهي بالعكس هي ليست عملية استسلام، وهي عملية استعمال قوة الاقتصاد في جلب المياه. احنا نريد ما نريد الحصة المائية للعراق الداخلية ما يتجاوز 20-25%، بالتالي انت عندك 75% خارج العراق. عملية استجلاب هذه المياه ليس بالأمر الهين بعدم وجود أي اتفاقية موقعة مع هذه الدول منذ تأسيس الدولة العراقية. هاي أولا. ثانيا الفكرة مو في بناء السدود. السدود الموجودة حاليا هي كافية وأكثر، وهناك بحيرات مثل بحيرة منخفض الثرثار، الحبانية، الأهوار، من الممكن أن تسع إلى ما يساوي بال130-170 مليار متر مكعب. العراق ليس بحاجة إلى بناء سدود، العراق بحاجة إلى بناء حاصدات المياه أو صائدات المياه، وهذا ما إحنا نبني به. النقطة الأخرى عملية الهجرة اللي دا يحصل في العراق بصورة عامة، الآن من قلت ثلثين بثلث، مو فقط في وسط وجنوب العراق، نفس الحالة موجود في الإقليم، نفس الحالة موجود في كل محافظة عراقية. هذا ما يعني أكو سوء خدمات أو أكو خدمات جيدة، إنما هي عملية البحث عن فرصة العمل. أمام عدم وجود فرصة عمل مناسبة في القرى التي تعتمد على الزراعة، فالمواطن بطبيعة الحال راح يهجر ويهاجر من قريته إلى مدينة أخرى. هي ليست عملية وجود خدمة أو عدم وجود خدمة، وإنما هي عن فرصة العمل الموجودة. أرجع وأقول عملية استخدام الملف الاقتصادي هو أنجح عملية، ليس فقط في مجال المياه وإنما في جميع مجالات الحياة. الآن أي نقطة إذا نلاحظ هسه حاليا الرئيس ترامب دا يستخدم الملف الاقتصادي وبقوة في كل إدارته مع أي دولة جديدة، مع أي دولة أخرى في خطته الخطط الجديدة لهذه الحكومة الجديدة. بالتالي الملف الاقتصادي هو أقوى ملف، وهو ملف قوي لا يمكن لأي طرف آخر استخدامه غير العراق. فموضوع استخدام الملف الاقتصادي من أولويات هذه الحكومة لغرض جلب المياه ولغرض جلب الرخاء لهذا البلد.
Thank you so much.
دەستخۆش. Thank you so much. ببورن ئەمە دەمنینە بۆ وەرگرتنا پرسیارە. نەتخوا. ئەم پانەڵی داهاتوش هەر لەسەر هەمان بابەتە، چونکە کاتمان تێپاران 5 دقە. Thank you so much. زۆر سپاس بۆ هەفکارن ئەمە بۆ سارا خانە و مهێڤانێ بۆ ئاوی پانەڵی گەلە سپاس بۆ هەوای کەرەم بکەن. پانەڵێ بهێت ئەوژی لەسەر گوهارتنا کەش و هەوایە لەسەر ئەو ئاستانگیان جیۆسیاسی. That's all. Thank you very much. برێز جەودەت بەهجەت مامۆستایە دە کاروبارن ئەم نانەتەوەییدا لە ناڤا سەنتەرێ ڕۆژهەڵاتی ولگەل باشوورێ ئاسیادا ji بووی خاندنên استراتیژی. جواد الخراس پرێڤەبەرێ یەکەم شارەزایە و ڕاوێژکارە di nava buwarên geşa sendinê da. حسن برتو جیو اینه هاتی افروکه مهوانه مهب تایبت جی دنوا پروگراما جینگه دا PCDBMB الجل عبد العزيز الغشيان قال بريز باول زيادكوفيتش كو بريفابري ناف بجيوانيه يا بشتافانيا اشيت كجبوي سنترا جنيف بو سياسة او لكاريه. باول please on the stage. الجل مهوان نوي بريزان جودت جواد الجل بريز حسن برتو عبد العزيز الغشيان كرم كان رجاء تفضل على المنصة لبدء الجلسة الثامنة عن التغيير المناخي والتحديات الجيوسياسية في الشرق الأوسط. يكتج بو ورقرانة جزمانة إنجليزي لزماني إنجليزية وبو كردي باسكم ولا كرديشة وبو إنجليزي هربها مانشت from English to from Kurdish to English وش إنجليزية بو كردية channelيك عربي دو تركي سه فارسي چوار جاري كتر دوباره كم بو بكار هناني أو أمري ورقراني راستا وخوبو إنجليزيك عربي دو تركي سه فارسي چوار.
Okay, good morning, everyone, and welcome to the second session, which naturally follows the discussion that we've just had about water security, because this session is about climate change and geopolitical challenges in the Middle East. My name is Paul Jatkovets. I'm the Director of Mediation and Peace Support at the Geneva Center for Security Policy, which is actually one of the partners of the Erbil Forum this year. I'm very happy to be partnering with Rudaw in putting together this prestigious event. I'm joined by three prominent experts on these issues, whom I'll introduce in a moment. Unfortunately, one of them could not be with us, but I do have some of his remarks that I can share later on in the session. But I'm very happy to introduce today, firstly, Professor Gaudat Barkat, Professor of National Security Affairs at the National Defense University in Washington, D.C. Then we have Dr. Abdulaziz Al-Khashyan, Senior Researcher and Research Director at the Observer Research Foundation, and Mr. Hassan Parto, Program Manager of the Disasters and Conflicts Branch at the UN Environment Program. Thank you very much for joining us. Now, this session is about two interconnected issues that are so central to security in the Middle East, those being climate change and geopolitical turbulence. As one of the most vulnerable places in the world to climate change and its wider effects, as well as one of the most conflict-prone regions, any discussion of a secure and prosperous Middle East must address both geopolitical and environmental challenges for the region, as well as understand and harness the interplay between them. So there's a need to develop diplomatic and peacemaking tools that are better suited to addressing these risks simultaneously, which of course have a cross-boundary character and therefore require interstate collaboration as well as joint methods and solutions. So our objectives for the session are to discuss these connections between geopolitics, conflict, and the environment, also to offer a prognosis on how these factors will combine to affect the region. And thirdly, hopefully we come away with some ideas on how security and environmental threats can be averted or mitigated through interstate collaboration or regional integration. And with all that in mind, I would like to firstly turn to Professor Gaudat Bahkat. Professor, I think that everyone in the room is interested to know about the new US administration and what it really intends to do in terms of foreign policy. And you being embedded in Washington, D.C., of course, I have to take this opportunity to ask you, given what you've seen in the last few weeks, what kind of approach do you think we're likely to see from the new leadership in Washington regarding security in the Middle East, and indeed energy security in the Middle East also, and in particular when it comes to preventing and resolving conflicts and managing diplomatic tensions? What are your thoughts?
Thank you, Paul. And before I say anything, I have to say whatever I say is only my opinion, does not represent United States government policy or Department of Defense. This is a very special time in Washington. Trump administration is very unique, at least for two reasons. President Trump is only the second president ever in United States history to lose election and then get re-elected. The only time it happened before was more than 130 years ago in 1888. So this is very unique in American politics. And second reason, United States system is built on check and balance. Most of the time, the White House is controlled by one party and the Congress is controlled by the other party. This way they balance each other. What we have now in Washington, one political party, the Republican Party, controls both branches, the White House and the Congress. President Trump has good reasons to feel that he has mandate, and he does not hesitate to use this mandate. This is why Trump administration is almost unique in American policy. When it comes to the Middle East does not only react to changes in DC, the Middle East takes the initiative. And in the Middle East, there is very important geopolitical change. Few years ago, especially before October 7th, some Middle Eastern countries were very concerned about Iran. I heard it many, many times that the allegation, the accusation that Iran controlled 4 Arab countries, Syria, Iraq, Lebanon, and Yemen. I believe this was way over exaggeration. What happened after October 7th, there is change in balance of power. To a great extent, Israel has emerged as the dominant military power in the region. And this is why there is shift in policy. Arab countries and Turkey are more concerned about Israel and less concerned about Iran. And this is why the Iranian president met with the Egyptian president, Jordanian foreign minister visited Tehran, Turkey is saying, President Erdogan said Israel will attack Turkey. So there is shift. most regional powers now see the threat from Israel, not from Iran. And what this means for the future of the region, first of all, international policy is never zero-sum game. There is always win-win situations. And second, in the region, Arabs, Turks, Iranians, Israelis, Kurds, and other communities have always lived side by side for thousands of years, and they will always live side by side. They have to learn how to live together. The challenge now, Israel will never live in security unless it is accepted by its neighbors. The Israeli government is the most extremist government in the country's history. Israel will never be able to force its way on its neighbors. There has to be two-state solutions. There has to be political compromise with the Palestinians, with the Arabs. Iran and Turkey are major regional powers. They are accepted by its neighbors. And the way forward, again, is for all the Arabs, Turks, Iranians, Israelis, Kurds, and others to accept each other. United States is major global power, works with other countries, with Russia, with China. As I said, international policy is not zero-sum game. I'm glad here we have Russians and Chinese, and this is good for peace in the region. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor, for helping to set the scene a little bit for our discussion. You spoke about the shifting balance of power in the region itself, increasing concern about Israel and perhaps less about Iran than we have been used to in previous years. And from the US, your insight about a new president, well, not a new president, but a returning president with a very powerful position and almost unprecedentedly strong mandate. And as you called it, a special and unique time in Washington. I suppose that means we're not yet quite clear what it all means, but we're all looking forward to seeing how that plays out, particularly in this region. I'll move forward now to Dr. Abdulaziz Al-Khashyan, who's joined us from Saudi Arabia. So a question about the view from Riyadh. Obviously, Saudi Arabia also plays a very important role in regional security and therefore potentially also environmental security. So what is the strategic vision in Riyadh when it comes to long-term security in the Middle East? And to what extent does that vision take into account the environmental challenges of the region?
Yeah, well, firstly, I just want to say thank you very much for inviting me, and thank you to the organizers for facilitating all of this. It's a great pleasure to join you all. So I think just want to add a few words of setting the scene as well. I think when we start looking at the region right now, there are spheres of reconstruction taking place. I think, as very astutely you put from the previous speaker, that Gaza is a situation that's still embroiled. A lot of people are pretty unoptimistic that the conflict will happen again. Syria is another sphere that requires reconstruction. Lebanon, and Yemen. When one looks from Riyadh, I think the situation suggests that, goodness gracious, there's a lot of there's going to be a lot of need to reconstruct the region. But also, Saudi Arabia in itself is having its own reconstruction of its own economy. And therefore, this really does ask a lot of stiff questions regarding how can Saudi play a role now, since it's embroiled in its own reconstruction of its economy, trying to be in a more diverse economy. How can this really start to play together? And I think this is now perhaps a time to really think about a new form of diplomacy that's starting to emerge in the region. And this will be reconstruction diplomacy. How can interests, regional interests, that are very necessary for Saudi Arabia make sense for Saudi Arabia in itself? And how can a Saudi Arabia that's also very very prudent with its fiscal spending address these very necessary issues? Because without Saudi Arabia, without a stable region, Saudi Arabia in itself cannot really achieve these very lofty goals that it sets itself for achieving. So therefore, it really asks a lot of questions. And one of these questions is how can perhaps the private sector play a role in addressing these issues? How can there be a regional vision and a regional framework that addresses aspects of reconstruction? And perhaps the principle, the guiding principle here is more integration. I think the fact of trying to integrate the region with itself more, trying to find mechanisms that facilitate more collaboration and cooperation is a sustainable way moving forward. This is, in my opinion, I think one way that could be sustainable, that could address the security concerns, because right now, without addressing these issues and without addressing these security concerns in the broad sense, we're inevitably going to have spillover effects. And these spillover effects is just going to create more and more cyclical conflicts time and again. And I think for Saudi and even others in the GCC, this is just unsustainable any longer. Right now, there's a desire to have this regional agency. And this means also addressing things of geopolitics. This means addressing things in economy, but this also, all these things can no longer be separated any longer from each other. They're all very interconnected, very much befitting with where the trajectory of the region is going, which is basically interconnectivity. And therefore, spillover effects in itself is inevitable. But perhaps the principle of spillover effects is also the tool moving forward, that creating space for cooperation is the way moving forward, and having, an environmental issues or economic issues, or having industrializing the environmental issues in itself, and creating more jobs and creating more opportunities is something that will keep not only addressing the security issues, but it will keep the main stakeholders interested. This is again we're talking a great deal here about the necessity of the right discourse moving forward, and how can we have these key stakeholders, be it Saudi Arabia, be it Europe, or be it the new Trump administration, incentivized and attached. And that's why I think it's very important to invest in specific logics that, as continuing from the previous speaker, that's more win-win. And how can this be a more integrated and interconnected region that has regional agency, and inevitably, this is then a long-term investment towards security in the broad sense when it comes to not only geopolitical security, but also environmental security, and it addresses all these issues simultaneously.
Thank you so much, Dr. Al-Kashian, for that important perspective from Saudi Arabia, which is working through its own economic reconstruction. I appreciated you introducing these new ideas on reconstruction diplomacy as a means of promoting regional integration and economic connectivity, but also implying that there are stronger roles to be played by other actors, not just governments, but also the private sector, not just in economic connectivity, but also in other areas such as environmental security. So thank you for that view from Riyadh. And now we'll pass over to Mr. Hassan Barto. Hassan, you bring to this discussion vast experience in post-conflict environmental assessments and environmental recovery programs all over the world, including in this region, in the Middle East. Based on what you've seen in your work, what would you say are the main opportunities as well as the main constraints in trying to forge a more cooperative interstate approach to dealing with environmental impacts of conflict?
Thank you, Paul, and good morning, everybody. I mean, over my 20 years, I think, experience working on the environmental damage and harm caused by conflicts on the environment, I think one thing which stands out clearly is that most countries, there's a recognition that protecting the environment from the harm caused by conflicts is one of the main areas of potential cooperation. When we, as the UN Environment Program, when we started working on the environmental aspects of conflicts, the initial request came from regional countries. The first, kind of benchmark case was the Kuwait War in 1991, when over 600 oil wells were set alight, and that created all kinds of issues around transboundary pollution and spills into the Gulf. Then the actual kind of more systematic engagement by UNEP in this area began after the Kosovo conflict in the Balkans, when the riparian countries of the Danube Basin were concerned about the pollution from the military strikes against the industrial facilities in Serbia. So it was always the regional countries which were putting the environmental aspects as a prominent issue in international fora. So I think that's on its basis, that recognition of the environmental damage is a key incentive for getting the member countries engaged and to create diplomacy to find solutions to these issues. On a more practical level, I'd say that what I've learned is what actually really is the most successful way of engaging countries and trying to build bridges between countries around these issues. It goes around issues of data sharing, knowledge sharing, expertise, sharing environmental solutions and technologies to deal with issues of water scarcity, of pollution, of contamination, of managing waste, looking at renewable energies. And I think leveraging that data, that science, it's a neutral language, It creates, a catalytic, I think, space for different actors to engage and to build confidence, to build connections between experts from different countries around these issues. And in the case of this region, as I am seeing it and in the projects that we have worked on, we see that there is, like, I would say, kind of a hub of now of environmental knowledge, of state-of-the-art technologies around the environment, around, for example, renewables and desalination in the Gulf region, in places like Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and they've taken that narrative quite strongly. There's a lot of initiatives, for example, now that are taking place by Saudi Arabia about the Green Middle East initiative with planting of around 50 billion trees, a much more greener vision for the region. And I think leveraging the financial and expertise that is available in the Gulf, which includes many of the people who have, coming from the Mashriq region, who have moved over, from places like Sudan, from Egypt, from Iraq, and are living in the Gulf. I think there's already those connections. And one big advantage of this cooperation is in the Arabic language. And these are Arabic-speaking experts. I mean, that makes a huge change in the way that the cooperation and the take-up can build and progress. If you bring experts, and now, for example, in places like Iraq, who have come from several conflicts, they have also built their expertise, and they can share that expertise in the reconstruction. For example, in places as you just mentioned, in Gaza, in Syria, and other places. I'll give you one specific example. Because a lot of the conflicts now are in urban areas, like in Gaza, we have huge amounts of debris and rubble that is being created, around 50 billion tons of rubble. Iraq faced the same issue, around 55 billion tons of rubble, also created from the ISIL conflict. Now there's a lot of expertise around recycling that rubble, around reusing the applications to use that rubble in the reconstruction itself. So I very much agree that these, there's all these various solutions and technologies that are available could help foster the reconstruction diplomacy that was just spoken about. And there's all kinds of scalable business models and public-private partnerships that can help foster this. In terms of the constraints, I'd say from what I find is the red tape. There's a huge amount of red tape. There's layers of bureaucratic complexity that slows down responses. It creates a lot of barriers between countries, and just simple issues like visa clearances. How do you deploy experts from within the region to actually share that experience and share that expertise? If I look at other countries like in the EU, they have standby capacities of rosters of experts. When there's an environmental emergency, when there's an environmental damage, they can mobilize and deploy that expertise, quite effectively to be on the ground. There's safety protocols. There's, that also assure the countries that are deploying those experts to be able to manage and provide that expertise. And then maybe another important constraint is that there are some void spaces on the map. There's areas where we don't have states. We have, or maybe not like recognized authorities as such, but there are environmental issues, and there are environmental issues that are happening in those places which are across border. We talked about northeastern Syria, for example, as one location, but also in places like in Sudan. Also, we have non-state actors, and looking at ways to engage with those also in Yemen and with the de facto authorities as well will be important to resolve.
Thank you so much, Hassan Parto, for these important reflections, and particularly for reminding us that post-conflict scenarios are not only grave challenges, but also opportunities for promoting regional cooperation, and that there are many areas for win-win cooperation, including data sharing, technical exchange, that can actually help build confidence between countries. And this is a logic that's created a hub of innovation and state-of-the-art knowledge in the region, with the challenge being, of course, to better leverage this knowledge and innovation for the benefit of the whole region. So that's from our panelists so far. We did have a fourth panelist who unfortunately couldn't join us owing to a family emergency, Dr. Jawad El-Kharaz. But I did ask him to send a few points, which I'll just quickly cover in 1 minute before we open up to questions from the floor. So Dr. El-Kharaz, his main point was in answering my question about what inspiration we can draw from elsewhere in the world for examples of partnerships on environmental issues that have helped promote peace and trust and confidence between countries. He mentioned that environmental challenges, as Hassan just mentioned, when they're approached collaboratively, can become powerful catalysts for peace and stability. One example is the Blue Peace Initiative, which promotes creative and innovative ways to improve the use of cross-border water as a peace-building instrument by facilitating collaboration between governments, non-governmental organizations, authorities, private sector, research institutions, and young people. And the Blue Peace Middle East Initiative works to transform water from a source of crisis into a catalyst for socioeconomic development, cooperation, and peace in the region. It's become the first regionally owned water cooperation mechanism in the modern history of the Middle East. Another example is the Nile Basin Initiative in East Africa, which brought together 10 riparian countries, often facing historical tensions like Egypt, Sudan, and Ethiopia, to cooperatively manage the Nile River's resources. So through technical cooperation, data sharing, and joint infrastructure projects, the Nile Basin Initiative has fostered dialogue, even during disputes over the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam. So what's instructive here is the focus on mutual benefits, such as hydropower generation and flood control, that creates interdependencies, encouraging countries to prioritize negotiation over conflict. He also mentioned the European Union's Energy Union, particularly its cross-border renewable energy projects. So countries like Germany and Denmark have integrated their wind and solar grids, supported by the EU's legal and financial frameworks, to optimize energy security and reduce carbon footprints. And this model demonstrates how energy diplomacy through joint investment and infrastructure can build trust and economic ties. Another example was the Mekong River Commission involving Cambodia, Laos, Thailand, and Vietnam, which shows how regular data exchange and joint environmental monitoring can mitigate tensions over hydropower development. In terms of the Middle East, he argues that technical cooperation is a low-risk entry point for building trust. Whether it's sharing solar yield data or coordinating desalination innovations, starting with practical, apolitical steps can build confidence. Second point is that institutions matter. So just like the Mekong River Commission, and the Blue Peace Initiative. Working through a regional body can help to formalize cooperation. And thirdly, interdependencies drive peace. So when Jordan exports solar power to Lebanon or Saudi Arabia invests in Iraq's green hydrogen, mutual reliance reduces the incentive for conflict. I think that's the basic logic here. And ultimately, environmental diplomacy, whether it's water diplomacy or energy diplomacy, can turn shared vulnerabilities into shared strengths. I think that's the main message coming from our speakers. So we now have still some 10 minutes, and I'd be very happy to hear from the audience. And if there are any questions, then please raise your hands. I saw one person there in the second row.
شكرا. تسمعوني؟ اسمي جواد من جامعة طهران، أنا جئت من إيران. أستاذ جودات، أشكرك. أنت أشرت إلى السياسات الإيرانية، وأيضا تطرقت إلى موضوع هام بالنسبة لنا وهو حل الدولتين. هل أنت متأكد بعد مجيء ترامب إلى السلطة هل تحقق هذا الموضوع يعني حل الدولتين؟ وهل ممكن أن نشاهد دولة فلسطينية مستقلة في المنطقة أم لا؟ وشكرا.
Okay, that's a tricky question, whether the two states is possible under Trump.
Thank you. 2 points about President Trump's policy. One, he is very transactional. It is probably a shift, like my colleagues mentioned, from geopolitics to geoeconomy. President Trump said he will visit Saudi Arabia if Saudi Arabia invests $600 billion. So it's all about economics, about money. I believe there is room for optimism, not only about two-state solution, but also about deal with Iran, between United States and Iran. Iran is very rich in oil and gas, and United States is interested in oil and gas. The bottom line for Iran, no regime change, and Iran has many times said we are not interested in building nuclear weapons. Iran has been very consistent that nuclear weapons are not part of Iran's defense doctrine. So I see there is room for a deal. President Trump wants to win Nobel Peace Prize, and deal with Iran will take him there. The other point about President Trump, he is very unpredictable and very untraditional. The first American president to make his foreign first foreign trip to Saudi Arabia in his first term. So I would not rule out a deal between Iran and the United States. Two-state solution is less likely. Last night, President Trump issued a new videotape generated by AI showing him and Prime Minister Netanyahu enjoying the beach in Gaza. So I doubt very much that there will be a two-state solution, and I hope I am wrong. Thank you.
Dr. Al-Ghashan, you wanted to add?
I just want to add a few words about this. Is that as much as it seems unlikely, we have no other option. This is the reality. And when it comes to my own work, my work really focuses on Saudi policy towards Israel. This is what my research has been about for the past 13 years. And in the past few years, it's been how to leverage Saudi Arabia into, and the potential of Saudi-Israeli normalization to a peace process. So I have a great deal of interlocutors in Israel. And we talk about this idea, and then we say, well, is it worth it to talk about a one-state reality? There is no one-state solution. Therefore, there is no one-state solution. Huh? I can't hear you. But this is something, this is why we have to keep being invested in this process of trying to make some sort of political horizon within a context of a two-state solution to make sure that not only these two peoples can live side by side, but also the way I'm looking at it from provided a cynical point of view, one can say, from a regional security point of view, that we have to securitize the lack of a two-state solution. Because otherwise, if this is going to continue the way it is, we're just going to have more spillover effects, more explosions taking place in the region. And therefore, it's up to us in the region to really begin to push very robustly in the ways that we can to make sure that there is some sort of solution. There is no other option. Otherwise, it's just going to be more cyclical conflict that's just going to spill over into the region. And the region will just simply not move on.
Thank you. There was one question there, and the man with the light blue shirt.
خیلی متشکرم که به من فرصت پرسش دادید. من ابراهیم متقی هستم از دانشگاه تهران. از این پنل خیلی آموختم. به ویژه بحث‌های آقای جودت بهجت. جودت بهجت در ایران چهره آشناست و بسیاری از مقالات و کتاب‌های ایشون به فارسی ترجمه شده. بحث‌هایی رو که شما داشتید رو من مقایسه می‌کنم با صحبت‌هایی که اخیراً جان مرشایمر 2 روز قبل در رابطه با ایران و آمریکا مطرح کردند. ایشون بحثشون این بود که لابی اسرائیل محور به هیچ وجه اجازه نمیده که زمینه برای بازسازی روابط ایران و آمریکا شکل بگیره. اگر بحثای مرشایمر که یک نگرش ساختاری به سیاست بین الملل داره تحقق پیدا بکنه، یعنی این که اسرائیل نقش بازیگر مزاحم و تنش‌زا رو در روابط ایران و امریکا داشته باشه، فکر میکنید در 2025 چه فرایندی به وجود میاد در وضعیت ایران و آمریکا؟ توضیحات شما رو من در بار دوم هم شنیدم. ایران مشکلی برای این نداره که سلاح هسته‌ای نداشته باشه. چرا؟ چون پادمان هسته‌ای رو پذیرفته، پروتکل الحاقی رو پذیرفته، برجام رو پذیرفته، ولی ظاهراً امریکا تمایلی به روابط عادی شده با ایران نداره و من فکر میکنم بحثای مرشایمر درست باشه. یعنی لابی اسرائیل محور سیاست خارجی آمریکا رو به گروگان گرفته. نظر شما در این ارتباط چی هستش آقای بهجت؟
Okay. Unfortunately, that will be the last question. I'm getting signals to wrap up. So let's hear 1 minute each from Professor Bagat. It was about the prospect for US-Iran talks and whether they're likely to resume and under what circumstances. So perhaps 1 minute from you and 1 minute from Dr. Al-Kashian.
Again, Iran is major regional power, and as I said, for thousands of years, Arabs, Iranians, Jews, Turks, Kurds, and others have been living side by side. And at the end of the day, there is no any scenario under which nuclear weapons can be used. As you all know, nuclear weapons were used only once, 1945. in the Middle East, people live side by side. In Israel, the Palestinians and Israelis share the land together. Iran is not investing in nuclear weapons. Iran is investing in drones, missiles, and Iran is very transparent about it. And Iran does not accept, and I believe it is true, that there are proxies. Iraq is an independent country. Iraq has never been dominated by Iran or by any other country. Same thing about Syria, about Lebanon, and about Yemen. So there is room for a nuclear deal. As I said, Iran does not want to make nuclear weapons. And Iran is willing to verify this and make deal with United States. And I would not rule out Trump administration negotiating like we did before with help from Oman. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Al-Ghashian, 1 minute.
I'll just say this. I think I would agree with your assessment regarding that there are some actors and some forces that would want to see more conflict between the United States and Iran. I think Netanyahu is someone who has been very pleased to hear some of this very hot air and bombastic rhetoric coming out. And I think he's trying to drag the United States gradually into the sphere of, and leverage the United States into attacking Iranian nuclear facilities. Now, this is a pull and a push, in my opinion, regarding the United States, whether, because there are these aspects, or there are this intention of trying to deter Iran, but also to negotiate with them. So here, my point is that unfortunately there are people who are politically invested in conflict. And this is unfortunately the region right now that we see. There are people that are just constantly want to see more conflict take place between Iran, United States, between Iran and Israel, between the Gulf states, and between Iran. I think the rapprochement between the GCC states and Iran acts actually as a security bedrock right now. I think the fact that is now a foundation that could be built upon more. Because right now there is, in my opinion, I'll just say this, there is a transitioning of the relationship and that GCC-Iran relationship from becoming something that's more exogenous, dependent on the whims of the United States, dependent on the whims of others, or who in the United States or in the offices, to something more intrinsic. And I think there is a real quest right now that the GCC and Gulf and Iran are beginning to try to seek security common grounds. And there's a lot of common grounds, but trying to seek genuine security common grounds that speak to each other's insecurities in the region. This is really the quest that we find ourselves in. And I think the longer that continues, that process, we're still not there, the more other powers in the world will find that as a foundation to develop with both, or to work with both the GCC and with Iran.
Thank you so much. Thank you to the panelists. Thank you to the audience for a very engrossing discussion. And we hope to continue in the corridors over coffee. And thank you for joining us. That was a great contribution, and we hope to engage with you throughout the conference. All the best. Thank you.
Thank you very much. والله من استخمي أوما استبانلستا كانوا مودريترا كان الله نما تشن رزاقرانا هردو دقة جارك من هر إشارات يام بيدن طواويغان چونك بانلي استا ليرا لسر أمستيجلنا وأم بانلاش تيكي زور جوان يعني شتيك وترا كباسي سياسة ترامب كرا لرجالاتنا وراس استا كاك روش هفكار ما روج علي زالك و روجنا من فيسا كزيرة كأجهش دنيا ودورو برا هاي بتايبرجي أمريكا دل قل مهوان خو ديفيد شنکر کو یاریده داره بری وزیر درve امریکا بو کاروبارن رجالات نزیک ده بحث گلک مجارکان گلک سپاس ده بحث سياسة دونالد ترامب كان لرجالات نافين سيد حسن شكرا جزيلا قال رجالات نافين سياسة إداراني بسرپرشتيا ترامب ديا تشابيت هر ترامب دست بيكر قد شريرة والصينم بجا أوكرانيا وروسيا بيت يانجي آگر بستا غزة دست بيكر لهنده كومنت هبون سر نافچه براستي قالك سرنج راكش بون دماكو قوتي درگهن دوزخه دل رجالات نافين فبن دماكو قوتي all hell will break out دماكو خلق ترسياي بشتي مثلا آگر بستا غزة مثلا ديا بارين سعودية اگر فيد سردانا يبكم فيد بوهي 500 مليار دولاران وبرهنانا استثمار بكت السر مثلا إيران دهي بير نفطة هرما كردستان و زخطة شاندناويج آلي عراقي وهمي مجارن از بگومانم که افکار ما روش دیوان بسیاراش مهوان خوکت کابو ما بو عراق بو ایران بو ما دیسان لترکیه لغزه لسوریه ترامپ دیچکت پلاناوی چیه سیاست در و امریکا بو روش حالات ناوین دی ابچه آوایی بید بجاز حس کم حتی کو نیف ساعت دی اف گوتو بیجا بردوان بیتن کرم که کاکروش
Well, thank you, Shahian, for that introduction. For those who may have difficulty understanding Kurdish, my name is Rudaw. I'm a Rudaw journalist, and I'm pleased to be joined by Honorable David Schenker, former Assistant Secretary for Near Eastern Affairs at the U.S. Department of State. As you've noticed, there's a lot of interest in understanding what the next 4 years of President Trump's term may look like for Middle East in terms of U.S. foreign policy. So let me begin by asking, are there any indications, or based on the few statements that we've had so far, based on the administrative staff picks, do we know what direction is the U.S. foreign policy under Trump may look like? Are we going to see a departure from the first term, or a repeat of the kind of reactive and transactional foreign policy that we saw in the first term?
Well, thank you. It's good to be with you today. Thanks for having me. Let me start by just citing a few characteristics of what our Trump administration policy and foreign policy. One, as you said, is transactionalism. The other would be the predilection to try and make deals. Finally, and then perhaps most importantly, well, maybe not finally, the disruptive nature of the approach. And finally, is, I think, a real strongly held aversion to war, very opposed to U.S. military action. I think there will be some, I think, consistency with the last administration, but I think many of these tendencies, many of these characteristics will be accentuated. By that I mean Trump and the MAGA group, and this will be more MAGA certainly than the first mandate, will be really against these forever wars, long-standing U.S. troop deployments. In terms of transactionalism, there'll be less sort of traditional American altruistic approach, more transactional approach, looking for distinct benefits to the U.S. from any particular U.S. action in the region. So I think there will be less engagement, less involvement. There will be a real heightened focus on U.S. domestic politics, that is anti-immigration, less of a focus on the U.S. traditional role abroad as the indispensable ally.
Right, but so the amount of focus that the U.S. administration, the next administration, is going to give to foreign policy, what are some of the priorities? Are we seeing Middle East being one of the priorities, or China and Russia and other issues are taking more of that priority?
Yeah, right now, listen, the administration came in, and they were the first administration. President Obama had talked about it a lot, the pivot to China. I think in the last Trump administration, they really did it, and part of that was because of COVID. We were forced to focus on China and the pernicious role they play in the world, and the nature of being the primary major strategic challenge for the United States. Trump 2 is all about the pivot to Asia. It seems right now that the focus is distinctly on the Middle East, and that may be the case for a little while longer. But I really do think that in terms of the major issues that we're looking at right now at this conference, Syria, Iraq, you're going to see downgraded U.S. involvement, less intense engagement, less willingness to devote troops, certainly less interest in humanitarian development assistance. He will be focused here in the Middle East on deal-making. Deal-making by enlarging the Abraham Accords, if possible, with Saudi Arabia. And this, we can talk about this more, but this may cause some issues of irritation between the administration and Netanyahu in Israel. But certainly a Saudi deal, and most importantly, as we heard in the last panel, I think a movement toward getting back into a nuclear deal with Iran rather than a military confrontation.
Right. Maybe briefly, but when it comes to in the last Erbil forum, you actually alluded to the areas of continuity between the first Trump administration and then Biden administration. So now maybe we revisit that question. What areas of continuity, or the biggest area of continuity between the previous administration and the second Trump presidency do you see, and what are the biggest areas of change?
Well, I think Iran will be one that there is an effort to get back into a deal. The difference between Biden and Trump, of course, is that Trump is going to try and get back into a deal and a negotiation with Iran through maximum pressure campaign. Another, I think, consistency between the administrations will be, of course, the support for Israel. I think Biden was beaten in many ways over a perceived somehow lack of support for Israel. I think he was among the most pro-Israel presidents in history, and I expect that to remain consistent. Beyond that, in the region, I think there will be even less interest on developments in Syria than there was in the Biden administration, in the Trump administration. And regrettably, I think, less interest in Iraq.
Right. So actually, to narrow the conversation down a little bit to Iraq and Syria, the Trump administration is now using heavy pressures on Iraq to push Iraq to resume Kurdish oil export, including threats of sanctions. What does this tell us about the Trump's approach to Iraq versus Kurdistan region?
Listen, I think there is within Washington, within both Congress and within the administration, an enormous amount of support and empathy for the KRG. that I think will benefit the KRG in many ways. In particular, if there is a downsizing of the U.S. military presence in Iraq, there will likely be residual force remaining in the KRG. There also, as there will be enormous downsizing in U.S. military financing around the world. I think the 20 million per month to the Peshmerga will likely continue, although it may be conditioned in some ways. It is already conditioned but not enforced on the unification of the Peshmerga forces. For the rest of Iraq, I think we're going to get back to where we were in Trump 1, which is starting to hold Iraq to a higher standard. And if you go back and read from, I think it was February 4th, the president's presidential security memorandum, he talks about Iraq as being a priority in the maximum pressure campaign against Iran, closing off all routes for the illicit use of dollars, smuggling, a source of cash for the regime in Tehran. Likewise, there will be moves against smuggling and an effort to compel the government of Iraq in Baghdad to stop providing safe haven support to Iranian proxies like the Hashid.
Right. But does this tell us anything in terms of how President Trump is viewing Iraq now? Does it tell us anything about, is President Trump viewing Iraq as an actor that needs to be coerced into certain demands that the U.S. basically is having in the region?
Yeah, I don't think President Trump gives a great deal of thought to Iraq. Right? Iraq is part of the maximum pressure campaign for him. It is a country, and if you read Joe Wilson's tweets, which I'm sure you're reading, many people here are reading them with great interest, it is a country that I think for good reasons has to balance its relationship between the United States and Iran. And yet, the government, of course, in Baghdad pays 338,000 members of the Hashid salaries, including several U.S. designated terrorist organizations. I think that's going to be a problem for the Trump administration.
Right. With the Trump administration's freeze on financial or foreign aid and orders to Pentagon to prepare for budget cuts, how likely is that the Trump administration will keep the Defense Appropriation Act unchanged or unchallenged? We know that the fiscal year for 2025 allocates about $528 million to the Peshmerga forces, the SDF, Iraqi security forces. So will that remain?
So you're talking about in Syria or in Iraq?
No, well,
so I think the $430 million or so in FMF and other economic aid to Iraq is going to be on the chopping block. Some of it may remain, but I don't think President Trump will consider that a priority, something that has benefited the United States. And no, by the way, when I say this, I want to say that I disagree. I think it's very much in the U.S. interest to remain engaged in Iraq for any number of reasons, not all of them related to Iran. But I think that the president will view not only the 2,500 troops in Iraq, but the 850 that were in Syria, now 2,000 since the revolution. I think he'll view these troops as part of forever wars, something that the president has said he was elected to end. And so I would expect that the president will get a perfect phone call from Erdogan. And Erdogan is somewhat of, in my view, the Trump whisperer. He will convince the president that Turkey can take up the U.S. role in Syria, can provide security, can secure a whole camp, can fight ISIS there in cooperation with the new government of Syria, and the United States will likely withdraw its troops. and later downsize its presence in Iraq.
Right. Actually, I do want to come to that, but before we get to that question, I do want to ask another question, now transitioning to more Syria-specific questions. Kurds have lost over 15,000 lives in fighting ISIS under American leadership.
Yeah.
On Tuesday, the Syrian National Conference concluded without a single Kurdish party being invited to the conference. In response, there were a joint statement by 35 Kurdish parties where they were expressing concern over the direction that Damascus is taking. Several declarations were made. None addressed Kurdish rights or even acknowledged their existence in the country. So the question is, how will the U.S. position itself in response to this kind of exclusion of the Kurds? Do you think Washington may address this kind of exclusion, or do you think it will remain indifferent to it?
Well, let me start off and say that there's been much hand-wringing about Ahmed al-Shara and the future of Syria, whether this is a member of ISIS or al-Qaeda. To be sure, in Idlib for 8.5 years, al-Shara actually fought ISIS and al-Qaeda. He has said many things that are the right things about the future of Syria, being tolerant, pluralistic, no implementation of Sharia law. He may end up eventually to be repressive. And I still think that's better than the Assad regime, which murdered 500,000 of its own civilians and forced 6 to 10 million Syrian, mostly Sunni Muslims, into exile abroad. I think that the murder resembles genocide, and the exile resembles ethnic cleansing. And so I think that Shara will be better. This conference that was organized there was a day and a half of notice. It was poorly organized. There was poor attendance. And it showed really a lack of organization and forethought. And I hope they are more conscientious in the future. What I would say is that this was a pre-conference to the actual constitutional conference. And I think the international community should be focused on pushing al-Shara and others to do better moving forward. Once again, this may turn out to be a repressive, non-tolerant regime. The Assad regime was repressive, intolerant regime, and also murderous. I wish I could have a higher standard of what my expectation will be, but I think the West really has to keep a close eye on the trajectory of this. And one final point. President Trump said he's not interested in being involved in Syria. I think this is a mistake. I think the United States should be engaged in helping to shape the future direction of Syria, to push them in a positive direction that is an inclusive society where all the components of Syria play a role and their rights are safeguarded. But I think so far we're seeing that this is just one area where Trump doesn't want to get involved, and he's delegating it to the Europeans.
Right. Now, given all the radical changes in the past year or so in the Middle East, is it any more feasible for President Trump to actually go through with withdrawing troops from Syria? I hear a lot of people saying, well, we do need American troops in Syria for multiple reasons, but also, is it a dichotomous choice? Is it either or is there some middle ground that can be worked out?
Well, listen, policy is people, and we still have to see who the people are in the right positions in Washington. We know Joel Rayburn will be coming to the Assistant Secretary of Near East Affairs. We'll see how involved the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, wants to be in this issue. The Department of Defense as well. I don't see them wanting to remain in Syria. But listen, Erdogan, the Turks want to play this role in Syria. They want the United States out. They see Syria as a sphere of influence. This, as you know, is not going to be particularly good for the Kurds, right? And that is actually the dichotomy, because Washington supports the Kurds, and yet Trump has this relationship with Erdogan that is probably going to mitigate toward a greater Turkish role in Syria. And the bigger the role that the Turks play in Syria, by the way, the bigger the role the Israelis are going to play, because these two states, while one is a major non-NATO ally and the other is a NATO partner, these two states are not getting along particularly well.
I'm actually glad that you mentioned that, because, so as you mentioned, the withdrawing troops from Syria is not just between Turkey and US and other regional actors. We've seen high diplomatic traffic between Saudi Arabia and the new authorities in Damascus. So the US legitimized its presence in Syria by basically countering Iran, fighting ISIS.
The United States has never had the authority to be in Syria.
Not officially, correct, but not officially. But now the Iran factor is kind of almost gone. Fighting ISIS, Turkey is proposing or suggesting that Turkey can lead a coalition to take over that role. So, but other regional actors, Saudi Arabia, for example, how they may react to an expanded role of Turkey in Syria.
Yeah, I think this is why we're seeing the UAE, Saudi Arabia, and other states in the region getting involved. They too are concerned about perceived Turkish expansionist tendencies. And I think, al-Shara himself, listen, al-Shara is no doubt Islamist to some flavor of Islamist, whether this is now Al-Qaeda light or Muslim Brotherhood, and that clearly is an ideological fellow traveler with Turkey, which is essentially highly sympathetic to the Muslim Brotherhood trend. And so there is, I think, a natural role or a relationship between the government in Damascus and Turkey. But this is a grave concern. Syria is the center of the Fertile Crescent, the center of the region. It's bordering on Jordan, American ally. It's bordering on Lebanon, on Turkey, on Israel, and Iraq, not least among them. It can do a great deal of damage if this country doesn't turn out to be a government that is effectively controlling its territory. There will be spillover and all sorts of regional consequences. Nobody wants to see that.
I'm wondering...
I mean, it could go the way of Libya, right? There's nothing that says that Syria is going to be able to, that al-Shara is going to be able to bring all these militias under his control and succeed at this state-building endeavor.
Right. Actually, I have time for one more last question, and I want to go back to the foreign aid and the President Trump's kind of focus on stopping foreign aid, especially when it comes to the situation of Al-Hol camp. We know in the past encouraging other countries to repatriate their citizens from Al-Hol hasn't worked very well. There are still over or close to 40,000 individuals linked to ISIS. So with the US administration signaling that it cannot fund Al-Hol camp, what other alternative strategies can Washington pursue to prevent the camp from becoming a ground for ISIS recruitment?
Yeah, listen, I think we're very early on into the Trump administration, right? They've frozen all funding. I think they have, in effect, taken a sledgehammer to the problem of U.S. spending when you really need a scalpel, right? And so, they cut the CDC, right? So we're not investigating Ebola in Africa anymore. We're not investigating outbreaks of measles or bird flu in the United States. They had to hire these people back. They fired the people in charge of nuclear weapons safety in the United States, right? They had to go rehire them. And this is another one of those cases where they have cut funding that helps secure. The people for the security are covered by Defense Department funding, right? There are still guards that are being paid. But the social services and other services when the camp have stopped. And this, in the long term, is going to create a large problem. And my hope is that Secretary of State Rubio will see this as something important and advocate for its return. Otherwise, there'll have to be other states, including perhaps Europe, that actually step up and cover this expense. Listen, the United States does an awful lot around the world. As a percentage, maybe not as much as many other countries, but as a gross amount, significantly more than any other country in the world in terms of humanitarian security. We have enormous responsibilities and enormous debt. And this administration is committed, for better or for worse, getting down the debt. And that means, and that's another principle of Trump foreign policy, is burden sharing, that our partners are going to have to do more. And while I disagree with much of the approach so far, I think burden sharing is right. I think it is not beholden, the United States is not responsible for funding every mission around the world, particularly missions where other states are going to be more directly affected and have the wherewithal to cover these expenses.
I mean, you worked at the State Department, removing this important diplomatic tool. Does it worry you that other actors may try to make use of it to regain a foothold in Syria?
This is a key question for the Trump administration and for the United States going forward. We have a very small tool, a small tool bag of foreign policy tools, right? We've got the diplomatic approaches where we can jaw and convince states to do things. We've got the military instrument. We can threaten you, we can attack you, we can drone you. We've got the economic coercive instrument. This is the Treasury sanctions, which are crippling, right? Incredibly difficult for many people once they get sanctioned. And then we've got what is the incentivizing device, which is economic humanitarian assistance. And I think that this is what traditionally, among other things, has set the United States aside or differentiated us from other states. We have been historically incredibly altruistic. And if you take that tool out of the toolbox, I think over time it will dramatically increase our ability to convince adversaries and partners to move in our policy direction. I'm not particularly worried about countries like China filling that vacuum. China doesn't give money away. China loans money at predatory rates that cause debt traps. You could just ask Jordan about that, or Djibouti.
I really do want to continue this conversation, but unfortunately I think we have very few minutes left for question and answers. I would ask you please to refrain from making statements in the interest of time. Just state your questions. Why don't we start with the gentleman right here?
با سلام به خدمت مجری محترم و جناب شینگر. خسته نباشین. من سیاوش حیاتی هستم، دبیر جبهه متحد کرد از کردستان ایران. پرسش من اینه که جناب شینگر، شما نقش و جایگاه عربستان سعودی، ترکیه، ایران، اسرائیل و کردها را در پروسه 10 ساله آینده منطقه چگونه ارزیابی می‌کنید؟ آیا ما به سمت تنش بیشتر پیش خواهیم رفت و یا ثبات؟ بازیگران جهانی رو نقششون در این رابطه چگونه ارزیابی می‌کنید؟ سپاسگزارم از توجهتون.
So this is Saudi, Turkey, and Iran, the role of Saudi and Turkey and Iran in the region?
I believe that was the question, including the role of the Kurds.
And the role of the Kurds. Listen, Saudi is a growing, I think, increasingly impactful, ambitious country with an enormous sovereign wealth fund that has aspirations to play a global diplomatic role. And we can see that they're playing that role right now. Not only in the region with the Arab Initiative on Gaza, but playing a global role in negotiating the release of American hostages or wrongly detained individuals in Russia. And so I think that Saudi increasingly is playing a big role. There's a bit of a competition between Saudi Arabia and the UAE for diplomatic role, economic role in the region, but I think Saudi, with much larger population, is in a position to play a very large role in the region going forward. And of course, somewhere out there is the possibility, depending on what happens in Gaza and the West Bank and with the Palestinians, for normalization with Israel, which would, of course, in many ways bring Saudi even closer to the United States with some sort of defense agreement. Turkey is a regional power with, I think, regional aspirations, wants to play a role throughout the region, has played an enormous role in North Africa, has a certain view of the United States, has a certain view of Israel, but also sees itself as a key regional player and a future not only military but economic regional power, with a role potentially, a bigger role to play in Europe going forward. Finally, Iran. And of course, I'm going to be careful to differentiate between the Iran in Tehran and the regime and the people. I think the regime is a destabilizing regional actor that until recently had played a really pernicious role in Yemen, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, just to name a few, funding foreign proxy armies that erode the sovereignty of states and bring wars to the region, and in all of those cases, enormous humanitarian suffering. I think they are, notwithstanding what we heard on the last panel, an aspiring nuclear state. This is why they're enriching to 60%. They're very concerned about regime survival, but have experienced enormous setbacks since Hamas launched its war against Israel, losing its chief proxy in Hezbollah that it created in 1982 and has been funding with enormous amounts of Iranian patrimony since then. They're gone. Their 40-year, 60-year strategic ally in Damascus is gone. And now I think the Hashid have pulled back on their attacks on Israel because they're concerned that Israel may attack Iraq. And of course, in Yemen, the electricity is down, and the Israelis have indicated that they're willing to sink a ship in Hudaydah or Salif. And so this proxy, too, is under pressure, with the legitimate government now starting to seize Iranian armed ships. So I think it'll be interesting. Trump wants to get into a negotiation with them, and we'll see if they judge that in their interest. I think they may, because they're concerned about regime survival. Finally, the Kurds. The Kurds are in, between Iraq and a hard place, as they say. They have to balance ties with the Iranians, with the Turks, and with Baghdad. Incredibly complex. I think the $16 per barrel deal that you just got, I think will put you on probably the best footing with Baghdad that you've had since before the referendum. And I hope that you continue to work on balancing your budget, economic reforms, and stability here to attract foreign investment. I think you are a relative island of stability and can play a very important role in ensuring the well-being of the Kurdish people.
All right, so let's see. We'll have time for one more question, and I think let's go to that lady over there. Sorry. It's a lady over here, too.
بخير بي مستر ديفيد بوغ كردستان. ورناجيريا من برسيالكم لبريزت هيا بريزت أماجد كرت وتت بالتلفون لنيوان أردوغانو لقال ترامبا تلفون يكراو أردوغان قناعتي بترامب كرتوا كأجر هاتو سوريا يخست جير دستي خويوانيا أو كاتك يشكان برو باشيروا من برسالي لبريزتكم آية أردوغان لو شوناني ككرت هيا لو شوناني ككرت هيا كرد تا إستا إسراحتي نكردوا تناند لسوريا كشري داعشي كرد تركيا كرد شري داعشي كرد
اگر ببوره کاتم زور
بس ارجعوا استا طواوي
Is there a question?
I'm still trying to
شري
figure out.
داعشي كردوا والله من لردا قشبينيك نابينم بو كورد كديموغرافينا وشكشت يكشوا لروج آفا بريز تاتشان قشبينيت بو باشا روجي كوركا إما بدواي حليف يكا أقرين وتمان شكور أمريكا حليف معنا.
Okay, the question is, how optimistic are you about the future of the Kurds in the region? Actually, if you don't mind, let me take one more question from this end. Khatun, agar برسياركي توش ورقرينو, that will be the last question that we'll take.
شكرا كثير. أنا رح أحكي بالعربي maybe.
أحسن.
أحسن. أوكي. زوزانا علوش من شمال وشرق سوريا. آسفين إنه دائما نحكي عن القضية الكردية بس لأنه ما لقينا الحل للقضية الكردية حتى نحكي عن القضايا الوطنية. أنا عندي سؤال، بأي مدى ممكن الإدارة ترامب الجديدة تعمل شراكات مع الإدارة الجديدة في سوريا؟ يعني ما رح أحكي على انسحاب من شمال شرق وتداعياتها على المنطقة، ولكن سؤالي، أنا جديد رجعت من دمشق والوضع كارثي لأبعد الحدود، فلأي مدى إدارة مثل إدارة ترامب بتاريخها ممكن تكون شريكة مع الإدارة الجديدة في ظل عدم وضوح الرؤية الديمقراطية والأقليات وما إلى هناك في سوريا؟ شكرا كثير روج.
شكرا. Okay, so the Kurds, let me say, I am not a fortune teller. I would tell you that my prediction of the perfect phone call that is coming between President Trump and President Erdogan is because this thing happened in 2018 and Trump agreed to a withdrawal from Syria. And I think that tendency to decrease U.S. military footprint in the region is even more pronounced now than when he agreed to it the first time. I am optimistic because I think it's not only because I think there is a sympathy and a respect and a special, I think, understanding of Kurds in Washington about the bilateral relationship. That's one reason. The other is because I'm hoping that your leadership will somehow move from two camps into a unified camp to present Kurdish interests as a unified interest in Iraq. It will make you a more effective body with Damascus, a more effective force, and a more effective advocate for your national interests, right? Both as a federal component and as a national actor, because you are a part in the end, whether you like it or not, of Iraq. And so, listen, I'm not particularly optimistic for the national project in Syria, right? I think, unfortunately, the institution building of Rojava that has happened since the SDF took on its role is something that both al-Shara and seemingly the Trump administration is not going to advocate for. So I think that while the al-Shara and the new government in Damascus is not interested, I don't think they have a particularly good understanding of what federalism is, but they have already said they don't want it, and I think there is a move toward incorporating the SDF back into the national Syrian army, not the Turkish-backed national Syrian army, but the national army of Syria. So U.S. relations with al-Shara. Once again, there is enormous anxiety in Washington I've experienced it talking to Syrian Americans and others about what the future nature of the al-Shara regime or government will be in Damascus. I don't think the Trump administration is going to be focused on human rights, right? Although Trump 1 was certainly focused on minority rights. You can see what we did in terms of funding in Iraq. Much of the funding went to protecting minorities in Nineveh, right? I think that if this issue is presented this way in Washington, I think there will be a better chance, but there has not been, I think, an effective messaging of what the future Syria is going to be and what it is right now in Washington. There's a view that al-Shara is, ISIS or Al-Qaeda. Once again, he has said all the right things. He has not taken a great deal of actions that would lead us to believe that he's heading down the road to be the Islamic State of Syria, right? He says he doesn't want to do that. He has done a number of things that would, but for the administration, I think it's a matter of watch and then verify, right? We're going to have to judge him and the actions of the government of Syria every step of the way and hold them accountable. And I think that's going to be harder if we are not engaged and involved every step of the way, if we're not providing humanitarian assistance. It's not enough for us to stand on the sidelines and tell the Europeans what to do, or tell Saudi Arabia what to do, or try and convince them to withhold funding if they're not moving in a direction. I think we too should have skin in the game. This is a critical moment. Syria is a critical country, and we have to be there. And I hope as time goes on, the Trump administration will realize that.
Thank you very much, Mr. Schenker, and thank you all for your attention.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yeah.
ام درکچینه پنل بهت اجبارکو دم مجلة كيما زانياري هلاو چواشكاري لسردمي ناكو كيكاندا قناغي 7 أكتوبر تاوكو كوتني بشارست أفا ناف نشانا أفا بانلية كودي برز يوسف جان لكورين فانل سنتري ويلسون دي أو بريفابت دينا صادق يكجي آخفتن كرا سبيكرا لكولين فانا بلن دانشتجيل تقيها توي جينوين ديجيتاليين أتلانتيك كونسل دكتور محمد أبو رمان دا مزرينير بيمانجها سياسة وكمالجهو وزير روشنبيري ولاوان الأردن يوسف They will provide. Hello. بيان التل أندام دسته أمين داران دامزراوية جنشينا بادشاه أردن ميديا. تفضلوا. أفاكو فيس بدي مديتي سر مسألة جوهرتنا كشو هواي بومديات كاتن وهندك هرشين نين تقليدين وكهنا يعني شوي دركتين أمتنا بحث مثلا أمني وسياسيا راستا وخوب كان كهرشت كان سر أمنيات جواكيل سر برفرح بنا تيروري خرابونا روشا خلكي يكجي هرشين دين نراستا وخو ينكو براستي جي نوكا باون نوكا توند بوينا زانياريين هلا نجبركو زانياريين هلا يعني نبتنه هندك تشتم بسيطة كان بو خلكي وتخزمتا ولاتان دا سوشيال ميديا دا وميديا دا لبراستيجي الرأيات جوهرن دا ما رأيتنا جوهرتن يعني الدجمنتنا دس نشان كرن أفانو كان سوشيال ميديا تشد بيت لايكك وكومنتك رأيك براستي أم بكيمي واردقرين أبرو كالفيري دي هتا بحث كرن ما في خلكي تتا بمبكرن ديسان تجيروك بخلتي وبشاشي تنا فجرانج برويجي جالك تأثيرها هاي أفجا اتنافا في بانل دا حتى كو 35 دقيقة دي يعني يازو 35 دقيقة دي بابته هنا بحث كرن از بيجم برسيار نهينا ورگرتنج بركو براستي پابندرين برسيار كرنه بتنه شروبات هتا كرن اگر برسيارا كرتو پخت با براني دهنا ورگرتن بس الفيري براستي جيب جالك تنا دريش كرنج بو خدمات آدمي بلکه هم برسيارا ورنگرين انو که کرم کن گل هفکارن ما اوی پانل نو که هتا پیشکش کرن سر زانیارین هلا
I'm sorry?
Hassan or Sarah?
I'm going to start with Dina.
Okay. Because of the graphic. Your photo, Mohammed's photo is there.
Oh.
Do you mind to change your seats, please? I'm so sorry.
Oh,
It's
okay.
because of you.
Hey.
Not because of me.
No, okay.
I'm so sorry to ask you that. Thank you very much.
I should have worn my glasses. I think we can start now, right? Hello, everyone. This is Yusuf Jan. I'm with the Wilson Center in Washington, D.C. And we're going to be talking about misinformation and disinformation in times of conflict today. I want to avoid word inflation, so I'm just going to use disinformation because it's too much to call it misinformation and disinformation. Again, good morning, and thank you for this great panel, and thank you to our esteemed speakers. We're going to talk about disinformation today, and obviously, information as a concept has been central to war, to conflict, since conflict ever existed. But today, with our technology, with our digital world, it's much more prevalent, and it's much more dangerous and impactful to our daily lives. We're going to be talking about disinformation in the Middle East specifically. Obviously, it impacts all over the world, but there are specific things we want to talk about when it comes to the region, how it impacts the region, and essentially what we can do about it. We have a great panel today. We have Dr. Mohammed Abu Rahman, Associate Professor at Prince Hussein School of International Studies at the University of Jordan. He also served as Jordan's Minister of Culture and Minister of Youth. We have Bayan Tal. She is a media and communications expert with over 40 years of experience, and she served as the Director of International Media and Communication for His Majesty King Abdullah II, and later as the first female Director General of Jordan Radio and Television Corporation. We also have Dina Sadek, who's a resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council's Digital Forensic Research Lab in Washington, D.C., and she leads research in malign foreign influence and disinformation in the region in the Middle East. So I'm going to go ahead and start with our conversation. My first question is, what makes the Middle East unique in terms of disinformation, in terms of how we can counter it, and its impacts on the ground in terms of policy, in terms of how it impacts conflict regions where we have an abundance of those, unfortunately. So, Dina, if that's okay, I want to start with you.
First of all, it's really great to be here. Thank you to the Wilson Center for organizing this panel, and to my fellow panelists for being here, and thank you to the Rudaw Center for all of your efforts in organizing this event. Misinformation and disinformation in the Middle East. What makes it unique? That is a very, very interesting question itself, because there is no uniqueness about false information that deceives people. I think if we are talking about uniqueness, we can talk about how disinformation and misinformation in the Middle East is associated to particular events that are taking places right now in the region. So starting from October 1st, 2023, I can say that we have seen an all-time rise in misinformation and disinformation across the region and about the region in other parts of the world. This disinformation and misinformation does not only happen in Arabic, it does not only happen in the languages and the dialects and the areas that are impacted by it, but it has global impact because of all of the different various interested parties and what is happening in the Middle East and the conflicts that are escalating. Apart from conflicts, there's fair amount of misinformation and disinformation in the Middle East that's caused by democratic backsliding and less focus on press freedoms and that kind of thing. But the most important and impactful type of misinformation and disinformation that we're seeing right now in the Middle East is the type of misinformation that can have deadly consequences, which is in the conflict right now that has been active and unfortunately expanding to new parts of the region that we I don't think that anyone in this room hoped that it would be expanding to. So this misinformation and disinformation, some of it is overall strategy based on the different actors involved in the conflict, and they promote information aligned with their worldview and how they would like to see policy implications. But there is also the incidental pieces of information about particular events that take place, such as a hospital bombing or return of hostages, and particular narratives happen around that ends up causing confusion among audiences and even leaders around the world.
Thank you so much, Dina. I'm going to turn to Dr. Abu Rahman with the same question. How do you see the Middle East in terms of its uniqueness in disinformation? What makes the region unique in terms of how we counter it, or if we can counter it? What are the impacts of it, and the future of the information atmosphere in the region?
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. If you allow me to turn to Arabic, to speak in Arabic, I prefer to speak in Arabic. إذا كان الحديث عن الحرب الأخيرة على غزة، فأعتقد أنها تشكل نقلة كبيرة وخطيرة على صعيد الإعلام والبروباغندا والدعاية السياسية، لأنه الحرب الأخيرة شهدت بالوقت نفسه حرب إعلامية، وما يمكن أن نطلق عليه حرب الروايات أو حرب السرديات ما بين إسرائيل وما بين الفلسطينيين، ومعهم نسبة كبيرة من العرب والمسلمين. والشيء اللي لاحظناه كون احنا في معهد السياسة والمجتمع في عمان مع منظمات محلية أخرى، رصدنا ملايين، قمنا بتحليل السوشيال ميديا وتحليل ملايين المشاركات على السوشيال ميديا، ووجدنا في البداية أنه الرواية كانت خاصة باللغة الإنجليزية، نسبة كبيرة منها باللغة الإنجليزية كانت تميل الرواية لصالح الرواية الإسرائيلية، وكان في جزء كبير منها مبني على البروباغندا الإسرائيلية. الحديث أنه 7 أكتوبر قتل الأطفال وقطع الأعناق، اللي تبناها الرئيس بايدن، ثم عاد واعتذر واعترف أنها كانت ليست صحيحة. وبالتالي وجدنا الشيء المهم في الموضوع، وجدنا أنه نسبة كبيرة من هذه الأكاونتس أو هذه الحسابات اللي استخدمتها إسرائيل كانت في الهند وليست في إسرائيل، بمعنى أنه كان في واضح تماما أنه في استعداد إسرائيلي للحرب الإعلامية والحرب السيكولوجية بشكل رئيسي في الحرب على غزة بعد 7 أكتوبر. وبالمقابل بدأت حرب رواية أخرى أو حرب مضادة، حرب روايات مضادة أو كاونتر ناراتيف من الجانب الفلسطيني والجانب العربي، واستطاعت أن تحدث فرقاً. ولاحظنا كيف استطلاعات الرأي في الولايات المتحدة الأمريكية أظهرت أنه تقريباً نصف الشباب في أمريكا يرفضون الرواية الرسمية لوسائل الإعلام التقليدية الأمريكية. فالحرب الأخيرة كانت بالفعل هي حرب روايات، حرب سرديات ما بين إسرائيل واللوبي الصهيوني الموجود في الولايات المتحدة الأمريكية وما بين الفلسطينيين ومؤيدي القضية الفلسطينية في العالم العربي. النقطة اللي بدي أشير لها، أنا بعتقد بعد الحرب على غزة وبعد التطورات الأخيرة بنقدر نحكي كلياتنا باي باي للمهنية الإعلامية. لم يعد هناك إمكانية للحديث لا عن حرية إعلامية ولا عن مهنية إعلامية في كل العالم، حتى في وسائل الإعلام الغربية. طيب المفارقة اللي أنا بدي أحكي على الصعيد النظري هنا، إنه سابقاً وأنت كنت تحكي على الميدل إيست، لماذا أهمية هذا في الميدل إيست؟ سابقاً كانت النظم الموجودة في العالم هي تقوم بعملية الكنترول، عملية السيطرة على الإعلام، وبالتالي جزء رئيسي من قدرة الدول أو الحكومات على السيطرة على الرأي العام والجمهور هي في قدرتها على السيطرة على الإعلام وعلى المعلومة وعلى الرواية. في مرحلة لاحقة بدأ الإعلام الغربي وكأنه بشكل حالة مختلفة، والحرية الإعلامية الموجودة بتشكل شيء مختلف تماماً، وبدأت حتى الدول العربية وخاصة منذ بداية الربيع العربي تفقد سيطرتها على الإعلام، وأصبح دور السوشيال ميديا دور مهم جدا في إعادة تعريف المجال السياسي في العالم العربي. أصبح الجيل الشباب بيعتمد على السوشيال ميديا للخروج من سيطرة النظم الشمولية. لكن الآن حتى السوشيال ميديا بدلاً من السيطرة النظم الشمولية صار هنالك مزج كبير وخطير بينها وبين البروباغندا والدعاية الإعلامية، وبالتالي وشركات البي آر. يعني أصبحت البيرسبشن مانجمنت، إدارة الاعتقاد، أكثر أهمية في أغلب المؤسسات الإعلامية وتستغل. وبالتالي يعني بدلاً من السيطرة على يوسف السيطرة على المعلومات والسيطرة على الإعلام، أصبح إغراق المواطنين في المعلومات والإعلام، ولكن بصورة موجهة ومرتبطة في شركات البي آر والعلاقات العامة، واللي بتشتغل على مسألة إدارة الاعتقاد أو إدارة المعتقدات في العالم. وهذه لم تعد هنالك فرق ما بين الدول العربية ولا الدول الغربية. وبالتالي أنا بعتقد أنه في المرحلة اللي إحنا كنا نفترض أنه الحرية المعلومات تشكل قدر أكبر من الحرية، أعتقد صارت تشكل قدر أكبر من محاولة السيطرة على العقول وعلى السيكولوجيا الجماهيرية في العديد من دول العالم. والحرب على غزة كانت نقطة تحول خطيرة في هذا المجال.
Thank you so much, Dr. And Bayan, last but not least, I want to turn to you with the same question about what makes us unique in terms of disinformation, about media, how government approaches it, what are our problems that are not necessarily don't exist outside the Middle East, but are more prominent or less prominent here in the region. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Youssef. Thank you, everyone. Hello, everyone. Thank you, Rudaw and the Wilson Center for the invitation. I would like to build on what my co-panelists said, which is, and focus on 2 points. How this, the genocide in Gaza and how it has impacted information flow as well as freedoms. We have 2 issues to deal with, the increase in misinformation, disinformation, and how Western mainstream media assisted and justified the war in Gaza, as stated by UN Special Rapporteur Francesca Albanese, who is also calling for an investigation into the role of Western mainstream media in the war on Gaza. The second point is how it has impacted freedoms of expression in the West, and how people are in the West, and especially in the United States and other Western countries, journalists are being canceled, besides being killed, of course, in the West Bank, Gaza, and Lebanon. At least more than 200 journalists have been killed in this war, more than any other conflict in history. It is also undermining free speech of artists, academics. Protests are banned in the West because pro-Palestinian, of course, and anti-Zionist. The media has carried and accepted, as Dr. Abu Rumman stated, the Israeli narrative and promoted it across this this conflict. I believe the fact that there are 2 positive points out of this. Number 1 is the rise in new players in the media, journalists, very young journalists, content creators, and influencers who had a key role to play in promoting the actual Palestinian issue with a context which was absent in Western media. The second point is the fact that we started appreciating and understanding the suffering that is taking place in the West Bank, the ugly occupation, Israeli occupation, and the ethnic cleansing and genocide taking place against the Palestinians. So there's a lot of more understanding in the West about this issue. What we need to do, if I may just go into what is needed at this point, if we go back to the issue of disinformation, misinformation, It's like scientists have drawn an analogy between misinformation and viruses, because when you say a lie or a misinformation went viral, so they are creating, they believe that to grow immunity in the public would be through media and information literacy skills. And that is how you immune people against the virus. And some would carry the virus and spread it, and that is what's happening with misinformation. A lot of people just spread the misinformation. Others would be carriers, but silent carriers. They don't play a role, but they are spreading it anyway. And you have those who are immune and would stop it, end it right there. So the immunity needs to rise in the public from 10 to 20 to 50 to 90%. And that is what's needed now. And this is something that we can talk about later in detail, because, yes.
Okay. I'm going to follow up with a question about media literacy after my question to Dina right now, actually. I want to turn to you. We've talked about Gaza, Israel, October 7th, and there's the Syria component right now, and there's a lot of disinformation or propaganda about that online, on mainstream media too, not going to lie. So I want to ask you, your work focuses on digital forensic work. You look at, you analyze operations, you analyze online coordinated attacks, if you will, if that's the right terminology. So I want to ask, what has been your experience with regards to the Middle East in the past couple of years when it comes to examples, actual examples that have occurred online, whether it's state actors, non-state actors, because both are involved, let's be honest. And it's not just one single state, it's numerous states, numerous actors are involved in this, one against each other, using information as war. So please go ahead.
Thanks, Yusuf. I would say since October 7, my colleagues and I were monitoring conversations on several social media platforms, and I can tell you that the first perpetrator of misinformation and disinformation are average users like all of us, because during times of uncertainty, it is human nature sometimes to speculate, and some people are more susceptible to believing that information than others. Average users online on social media platforms are not as careful as we would like them to see. And confirmation bias is very well and alive. People tend to go online, and even on traditional news stations and newspapers, people tend to seek news and information that already aligns with their worldview and what they like to see in the world. So I would say that that played a big factor, specifically in misinformation. But I will add to that part of the misinformation that's being shared is some unwitting users who do not know that what they're sharing might be false, but other users share that information just in case it's true. I want more people to know about it, and that's not necessarily the best practice. But that was the first thing that happened after October 7, which caused a lot of confusion about how event transpired, who is involved, and what may happen next. State actors. In this particular conflict, we have seen a lot of effort from the Israeli government utilizing social media platforms to promote its own views and also narratives about the war. And we have seen that utilized mostly in the platform X. And there's a number of social media accounts that the Israeli government operates its narratives through. We have also monitored Hamas's activity on Telegram, which has shared fair amount of also propaganda narratives and violent narratives that tends to be sensational to kind of also get a rise of people in an already critical and volatile situation. Those are not the only two actors involved, I would remind. As I said, there's disinformation about this particular conflict in all of the languages that you can think about. We have seen it even in Spanish, where it's so far from the region that when you think about the actors involved, they're not always the ones that you might be thinking of, and even state actors work through private firms in order to promote their propaganda, in order to maintain their plausible deniability, and the attribution for those types of disinformation or smear campaigns is very difficult and unique, making it even more difficult to hold accountable the perpetrators of disinformation, whether they are state actors or non-state actors hired by state actors or non-state actors just amateurs online like to promote their own disinformation.
Thank you so much, Dina. And building on that question, your answer, my apologies, I want to turn to you, Doctor, and because since you have a lot of experience in the government, you have experience in regulation to a certain degree, I want to ask your perspective. And you, when responding to your first question, painted a relatively grim picture about the social media and how it impacts how we receive information. So yes, there is the regulation component, and there is always this criticism that governments are relatively slow to respond to the changing technologies, how people use those technologies. So I want to ask you, how much truth there is to that criticism to governments regulating, and also how should, in general, governments respond? Because the digital world is, how much you want to control it, it's very hard to actually regulate it to the degree that you want to address issues to the fullest extent.
شكرا يوسف. أنا بعتقد كان منذ الربيع العربي في العديد من الدول العربية كان هناك محاولات اكتشفت الدول العربية خطورة وأهمية السوشيال ميديا مع الربيع العربي، واكتشفت إنه هذا الشيء اللي كانوا ينظروا له الآيفون إنه عبارة عن جهاز تسلية وجهاز تشات، إنه الآيفون أخطر جهاز سياسي. أنا ما بحكي عن البيجر، أنا بحكي عن الآيفون كمعلومات، أخطر جهاز سياسي في اليد الناس الموجودين في العالم العربي، لأنه هذا كسر كل قواعد اللعبة السياسية التقليدية، أعاد تعريف المجال السياسي في العالم العربي، غير اللاعبين السياسيين الموجودين. مثل ما حكت بيان، اليوم أنت عندك مثلا في تحليل السوشيال ميديا، أنت بكل الدول العربية بجوز ما بتوصل ل5 ملايين أو 6 ملايين مشاهد، ممكن إنفلونسر واحد بوصل ل50 و60 مليون، وكان يغير كل البارادايم في موضوع الناراتيف. فصار في اكتشفت الدول العربية انه ما بيصير تضل علاقتها مع السوشيال ميديا ومع العالم الديجيتال انه علاقة يعني هامشية، فدخلت على هذا الخط من محاولة تنظيم السوشيال ميديا وتنظيم العالم الرقمي ووضع قوانين وإيجاد عقوبات، لكن الدخول كان سلبي أكثر منه إيجابي، بمعنى أنه حاولت هي تحد من تأثير السوشيال ميديا، بينما ما أدركت أنه السوشيال ميديا هي العالم الجديد اللي لا يمكن إلا أنك أنت تتعامل معه بطريقة مختلفة. في الوقت نفسه أنا بعتقد اللي صار أنه الدول العربية حاولت تتطور، كثير من الدول العربية وتابعنا إحنا بالحرب على غزة، الإعلام العربي كل وسائل إعلام، كل وسيلة إعلامية عربية كانت تحاول تدافع عن وجهة نظر الحكومة اللي هي بتتبناها وتحاول تروج لها من خلال كتاب، من خلال سياسيين. ولكن أكثر شيء أنا واجهته على صعيد الحرية الإعلامية أو لاحظته إنه حتى قنوات مثل الجزيرة، مثل العربية، مثل قنوات يعني هي أيضا كانت تستخدم الإعلام الموجه، يعني نفس الضيوف دائما ما نفسهم موجودين ونفس وجهة النظر ونفس الكذا. بالتالي أنا قلت لك أنا بعتقد الحرب على غزة هي عبارة عن باي للحرية الإعلامية والبروفيشناليزم والمهنية الإعلامية، لأنه خلص صار الكل بيفكر في البروباغندا أكثر ما بيفكر في الإعلام، بيفكر في الدعاية السياسية أكثر ما بيفكر في الإعلام. العالم العربي طبعا صار في فيضان في موضوع السوشيال ميديا، تأثير كبير على الرأي العام العربي، على السياسيين العرب، لذلك برضو العديد من الدول لجأت إلى ما يسمى الجيوش الإلكترونية. الجيوش الإلكترونية هي اللي بتحاول يعني تقدم من خلال السوشيال ميديا سواء ريل أكاونتس أو فيك أكاونتس، بتحاول تقدم من خلالهم رواية الحكومة في مواجهة الآخرين. لكن أنا بعتقد أنه لا، لسه السوشيال ميديا تأثيرها قوي جدا وخطير جدا، لكن بنفس الوقت من الملاحظات كمان السلبية اللي احنا ممكن نلاحظها في الحرب على غزة، حتى على مستوى الفيسبوك وعلى مستوى منصة اكس وعلى مستوى التليجرام صار في تفضيل لرواية على رواية. يعني انت لا تستطيع ان تنشر شيء يدعم القضية الفلسطينية لانه الفيسبوك سيحجب هذا الشيء والاكس سيحجب هذا الشيء. فصار يعني اذا جيل الشباب في العالم العربي عم بيشوف دولة اللي تدعي الحريات الإعلامية والحريات السياسية زي الولايات المتحدة الأمريكية، إذا هذه الدولة عم بتحاصر روايات أخرى وبتقمعها بشكل رئيسي ومن أجل رواية مضادة، فأنت أغلب يعني المفارقة اللي أنا بحكيها إنه في وقت يعني ينتشر، يفترض إنه الحرية الإعلامية تنشر الديمقراطية والليبرالية والحرية في العالم، صارت القناعة عند جيل الشباب في كثير من الدول العربية والإسلامية إنه هذه الحريات كذبة كبيرة وليست حقيقية، وإنه الدول التي تدعي حماية الحريات هي التي تحاصر وتحارب هذه الحريات، وبالتالي هذا يؤدي إلى شيء أخطر، يؤدي إلى زيادة جرعة الراديكالية في العالم العربي، وبالتالي بتزيد من الشباب اللي بيستخدموا السوشيال ميديا في اتجاه زي الحركات الراديكالية اللي تحشد الشباب في مواجهة النظم وفي مواجهة الواقع السياسي وحتى في مواجهة الولايات المتحدة الأمريكية في المنطقة، فالنتائج يعني في أكثر من اتجاه متضاربة.
Thank you so much. Sorry. Thank you so much, Doctor. I appreciate you saying that, the extremist comment, and I want to turn to Bayan with that actually, because you mentioned media literacy, and you mentioned in general what we can do about this whole issue. But what's happening right now? Youth should be the main target. Maybe, I'm not sure, but I feel like youth should be the main target of media literacy, starting from a young age, I guess. But I feel like, with AI emerging now, because, Doctor mentioned videos that are being watched 50, 60 million times, but you can't even tell if they're real or not. Like, even if it was real, they could be disinformation. But now you can make videos, basically, and post it on your, accounts. Even politicians post AI-made accounts nowadays that are, weird. But I want to ask your opinion about how we can approach that with media literacy. Is that going to be, at least sufficient?
Yeah, thank you so much. Okay, I think now just for everyone, media literacy is basically teaching people how to consume media and how to produce media ethically. And positively. It's based on 5 components: accessing media, where to look for the information, go to the right sources, analyzing media, understanding the messages and who created that message, why was it created, how is it impacting me, how do I understand it, and how each person understands the message differently based on our convictions, our values, our culture, our environment, and reflecting on the media. Reflecting means being more compassionate, more understanding, and producing media, which is extremely important. Creating media is extremely important, especially for young people. It gives them the power to be active players in their own communities. It also counters the negative and radical media, that radical material that is there that Dr. Abu Rumman mentioned, which would be producing media that is positive, that is not racist, that does not contain hate speech, that is more about realities. And the last thing is act. To act means to be part of their communities, to use that space, whether it is social media or other platforms, to create change in their own communities. So these skills in Jordan have been introduced into textbooks. Jordan is changing textbooks and has been for the last few years. And what we're doing, I'm leading a team of experts who are integrating all these skills into the new textbooks. We also have units in some books about media and information literacy. So creating a generation of critical thinkers is extremely important for any society. That's part of the solution, introducing media literacy into schools. And I think we're the only Arab country that has done that. And we were asked by the Arab League to actually help other Arab countries integrate and introduce media literacy into the, not just education, because we have a strategy that was adopted by the government, and it's based on 4 components: introducing media literacy in schools, universities, youth centers, and the public sphere. Now, the second component is the government. Governments play a key role in this. We would not have been able to do this and get that far without the cooperation of the government, which would be the Ministry of Education and the National Center for Curriculum Development. The second component is civil society. Civil society is very strong in Jordan. And I started the program in an academic organization, the Jordan Media Institute. And we have members from civil societies here, women, who are leading organizations like Samar El-Haj Hassan, who heads the National Center for Human Rights, Rasha Fitian, who heads the partner in this conference, the Politics and Society Institute, Dina al-Bashir, who is a member of the Jordanian parliament. This is her 2nd term. So civil society is critical in advocating for these skills, for media literacy. And without all this, there can never be, without free speech, there can never be all this. We need to raise the level of freedom of expression and make sure that people are able to express themselves freely without fear. We need free media because the public has lost trust in media. And especially in most Arab countries, media is owned by the state, the government. We have very few independent media organizations, but they also continue to be censored by governments. So introducing independent media is key. Otherwise, we will not be able to promote the narrative or the real issue of the suffering or the occupation without having professional media. Because there are people who my concern is, think that media is about propaganda, which is very critical, very serious, and that media employees feel that they are public servants or members of the government, and that is not healthy. I try to promote public service media, but it's becoming increasingly difficult, even in the West, in organizations that have, in the countries that have public service media. The public service media in the West played another critical role promoting the genocide in Gaza and failing to play their role as independent and professional.
Thank you so much, Bayan. And for time's sake, I want to turn to our audience for any questions that they may have. And please, if when you do ask a question, let's keep it as a question and not as a comment. Thank you. The gentleman in the gray jacket over there.
ڕۆژتان باش کەمال هەنجیرە لە ناوەندی توێژینەوە و ڕاگەیاندن و پێگەیاندنی پارتی دموکراتی کوردستان پرسیارێکی گشتگیرم هەیە ئەگەر لێم قوبوڵ بفەرمون ئەم بەڕێزانە هەموو قسە لەسەر ناوەندی ڕاگەیاندن و کاریگەریەکانیان و سنووری ئازادی و ئەو سەر لە شێواویەی کە لێشاوێک لە ڕاگەیاندکار لە شەڕی حەماس و ئیسرائیلە لە ناوچوون و جانیان بەخشیوە. من داوایەکی بچووکم لە بەڕێزیان هەیە. هەر ئەم ناوەندە ڕاگەیاندانە کە کاریگەریشی زۆریان هەیە لە ناوەندی ڕاگەیانی خۆیان و دەوڵەتەکانیشیان و ئازادی ڕۆژنامەگەریش کەمێک ئەلم وڵاتەی ئەم شاری کە جەنابیان تایاژین ئەوە چەند کیلۆمەترێک 100 کیلۆمەتر نابێ سەرێک بەن لە ئەو کەراسەتە گەورەی کە لە دەست داعیش لە شنگال لكرداني أيزيجي جيران هزارها شهيد من هي شهيد لتمني جواز دا جينوسايتي شي حقيقي لسدستي چندين دولت جينوسايتي شي نيو دولتي ناسين راوة أري برسيارم أويا
Sorry, can we get to the question? Because I know we have, for time's sake, just, yeah, thank you. Can we repeat just the question part, if that's possible? The speakers are not really getting the question. Sorry. Thank you.
چەند لە سنووری ئەو ناوەندە ڕاگەیان کارە ئازاد و سربەستانە توانیویانە لەو کارە سەتە بەرگە ساتە ئینسانیەی کە لە شنگالە ڕووی داوە ئامادە باشیان هەبێ یان بەلای کەمەوە شەهیدێکیان دابێ لەگەڵ ڕێزم بۆتان.
Did you understand the question, or do you want? Oh, okay. So I think the gentleman is asking about how social media or disinformation impacted what happened in Syria back in 2014 and Iraq in 2014 with regards to ISIS. If you want to take a stab at that, and then after that, we're going to end the panel. Thank you.
Would you like? Yeah. I can just. ISIS.
Yeah.
Not an expert on ISIS. What I can say is the ISIS era, I would say, it should have been a huge lesson for us to learn from for a few different reasons. Number one, when ISIS would take over a region, the first thing they did was change textbooks. It was all about education. They would change textbooks, so they would change minds and be more in control. They were very active on social media, and they knew how to get to young people through videos. They created songs. They were really good, really good. And they were recruiting Jordanians. We had an issue with ISIS. They were recruiting Jordanians online through these methods. They were using the tools of social media. We did not learn from that because we still have education systems that do not promote critical thinking and didactic learning. That does not correspond to the challenges that these children face on a daily basis when they go home, when they walk in the streets, when they go online. They have to be, we have to make a huge revolution in education to be able to challenge all this.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
اف پانلا داویتتن پانل بهت السر یاسا هالبجارتنین 2025 ببرن آسیا هالبجارتنین 2025 یا پارلمان عراق قناقه کنیه ج آلوزیان یا ج آراسته که بو ململانین آشتیه یندس حالاته مدیریتر اوه پانل مصطفى سرايا بربري بشا تويجينا ولكولينا Thank you so much. شكرا جزيلا. لكونا السنترا بيان بو تويجينو بلان دانانه اسو فريدون برلمانتر عراقي قال باريز دكتور مصطفى عياش الكوبيسي سكرتير قشتيه بارتا منومنتان اجتماعي ورائد فهمي سكرتير قشتيه حزب الشيوعيه عراقي. سيد مصطفى تفضلوا على الستيج. سيد رائد دكتور مصطفى استاذ رافع كاكاسو فرموا مسار ستيج. بو اوه پانل پرسیار نهاینا وارگرتن جارا كديم دي بحث دمي كينج بردمية براستي حتى كو ساعات دوانزا و 25 دقيقة اف بانلا دي بردوام بيت بشتينكي ما هف بيفينها قال جيجري سروكي حكومته كاقوبا طالباني ديل سرسي جيبيتن بجدا بجك التزام بدمي بكي
تيست. سيدات وسادة الحضور، تحية طيبة وسعدتم صباحا. أهلا بكم في ملتقى أربيل الثالث الذي ينظمه مركز روداو بالشراكة مع مجموعة من مراكز الدراسات والمؤسسات المحلية والإقليمية، مع البدء في العد التنازلي للانتخابات التشريعية القادمة 2025. تتجه الأنظار حول كل ما يتعلق في الانتخابات، من قانونها الذي عادت المطالب في تعديله، أو طبيعة الانتخابات القادمة والتحالفات وما تربو إليه هذه الكتل السياسية من مشهد قد يكون مختلف، بالإضافة إلى دعوة زعيم التيار الصدري السيد مقتدى الصدر لأنصاره لتحديث سجل الناخبين، خطوة عدها البعض تمهيد لمحاولة مقاطعة الانتخابات أو العودة. لا يختلف اثنان على صعوبة العملية الانتخابية في العراق ومطباتها وتعقيداتها، لكن هذا لا يعني الانكفاء وعدم الخوض في تحليل الواقع السياسي والانتخابي لها. في هذه الجلسة مع ضيوفي الأعزاء سيكون أنا معكم مصطفى السراي، مدير الأبحاث والدراسات في مركز البيان. لم أعرف عن ضيوفي، عرفتهم زميلتي قبل قليل، وتراعيا للوقت سأبدأ معك سيد رائد. أهلا وسهلا. سيد رائد، على الرغم من التاريخ الطويل يعني العمل اليساري السياسي في العراق، إلا أن تأثير اليسار ما زال محدوداً، سواء في الجانب التشريعي أو الجانب التنفيذي، حتى في يعني على مستوى المؤسسات غير الرسمية التي تعد جزء من النظام السياسي. هذا ما يدفعنا لتحليل يعني الموقف المستقبلي لليسار في الانتخابات القادمة بناء على التفاعلات السابقة والتوقيت الحالي. ذلك سؤالي: مع قرب الانتخابات وبدء العد التنازلي لها، هل بدأ اليسار في تنظيم نفسه للدخول لهذه الانتخابات؟ وإذا كان هذا التنظيم موجود، هل سيكون منفردا أو متحالفا مع كتل أخرى؟ وخصوصا نحن سمعنا أنه جزءا من الإخوان في اليسار قد يتفقون مع السيد رئيس الوزراء العراقي.
شكرا جزيلا وطاب صباحكم جميعا. يعني الآن نتحدث عن الانتخابات القادمة ومتطلباتها واستعدادات لها والمشاركة بها، ولكن لا يمكن الحديث عن الانتخابات بمعزل عما ينتظر العراق وما هي التحديات اللي يواجه النظام السياسي والوضع السياسي. وهذا حيحدد أيضا رؤية اليسار ورؤية القوى المدنية والديمقراطية. أولا نحن نعتقد أن النظام السياسي يعيش أكو مشكلة بنيوية، وهذه المشكلة البنيوية تختلف عن المشاكل الأخرى الاقتصادية والاجتماعية والسياسية الظاهرة. المشكلة البنيوية قائمة على أساس أن بني النظام السياسي الجديد والعملية السياسية على أساس طائفي وقومي، وعلى أساس هذه الطائفية السياسية والطائفية أيضا اللي تكرست في بناء الدولة. هذه من نتائجها كانت أولا بناء الدولة أصبح مختل، واليوم الكل يتفق أن الدولة عندنا ضعيفة مترهلة عاجزة إلى حد كبير عن تقديم كثير من الخدمات، والفساد أصبح جزء بنيوي من الدولة. والمشكلة تكمن الآن، وحصلنا يومين نتحدث عن التحديات والمخاطر المنطقة والتحيطة والتغييرات بالعالم، لكن كلها تجمع أنه بالعالم زادت أهمية الدول خلافاً إلى ما كان يعتقد به بشأن العولمة. وإذا كانت وبالنسبة للمنطقة مالتنا وتحدياتها، لأجل أن يكون العراق قادراً على مواجهة هذه التحديات الخارجية لابد أن تكون عندها دولة قوية، دولة مؤسسات، دولة تتمتع بشرعية مو بس قانونية وإنما اجتماعية كبيرة وقادرة على المنجز. اليوم هذه العوامل ما متوفرة. الدولة انتخابات يشاركون بها أقل من 20%، وبالتالي تمام ماكو حسب القانون هي شرعية، ولكن الشرعية الاجتماعية محدودة، ومؤسساتنا ضعيفة. وأمام هذه المشاكل الكبرى يبدو أن الدولة غير قادرة على أن تحافظ على نفسها وتحافظ على حقوق العراق وسيادة العراق بكل معانيها في ظل الأمواج المتلاطمة والأوجاع. فالانتخابات القادمة، وأخلص إلى ذلك، إذا نريد لها أن تكون خطوة إلى الأمام لمعالجة الأوضاع ولإخراج العراق من دوامة هذه المشاكل وربما الأزمات، إذن ينبغي أن نعمل لأن تكون هذه الانتخابات قادرة أن تعكس الرأي العام الشعبي بشكل صادق وعادل. اليوم إذا احنا عندنا نبقى 18% و 17% من المشاركين، 80% وأكثر هم خارج العملية الانتخابية، يعني خارج ما يشاركون، فإذا احنا أمام مشكلة كبيرة جدا. فما الذي ينبغي عمله؟ فإحنا من ناحيتنا مو بس كقوى، احنا الآن مشروعنا يساري لكن هو طابع مدني ديمقراطي، ندعو إلى أن الدولة تتجه نحو دولة المواطنة، أي تخرج من حالة دولة المكونات وكل مشكلاتها. اثنين، التغيير، هذا نسميه تغيير. هذا التغيير هو ليس تغيير أشخاص فقط، ولا تغيير فقط ربما بجوانب معينة مفردات سياسية، إنما تغيير يستهدف البنية، وبالتالي دولة المواطنة، وتغيير في التوجهات السياسية عموما وعلاقاتنا خارجيا.
شكرا جزيلا.
وهذا التحليل بس أخير شيء يقوله، أنه نسعى أولا لائتلاف وطني وديمقراطي مدني. قوى سياسية لا تزال مو كلها محددة، ولكن القوى المدنية هي جزء منها أساسي.
شكرا جزيلا. سأعود لهذا المحور بالتأكيد، لكن أنتقل إلى دكتور آسو فريدون. أهلا وسهلا دكتور. بالحديث عن المشهد السياسي الكردي قد يكون يعني أكثر تعقيدا، خصوصا من خلال استقراء التجارب الانتخابية السابقة، وانطلاقا من تجربة انتخابات برلمان إقليم كردستان الأخيرة، اللي بصراحة بينت كمية يعني الواقع المختلف في الإقليم، وخصوصا ما ينعكس عليه في ربما الانتخابات البرلمانية القادمة. لكن هذا نستطيع أن نقول هذا الخلاف قد لا يفسد للود قضية، لكن بالتأكيد أكيد سيؤثر، خصوصا في المناطق المتنازع عليها الذي تتطلب وجود القوى الكردية في هذه المناطق في قوائم كبيرة، تحالف أو تحالفين، للحصول على أكبر قدر ممكن من التواجد. لذلك في هذا الأمر هل تعتقد يعني الأحزاب الكردية ستلتجئ إلى الحكمة أم تتمسك بالعناد في خصوص تجاوز الخلافات وتشكيل تحالف كبير، يعني خصوصا في حديث عن بقاء قانون سانت ليغو بآلية سانت ليغو، أو آلية جديدة مختلفة تماما عن ما شهدت التجارب الانتخابية السابقة في العراق؟
صباح الخير، صبحتون بخير، جونايدن، جود مورنينج. أفتخر صراحة أن أشترك في مؤتمر فيه كل هذا التنوع ويسير بنجاح لحد الآن، وإن شاء الله يخرج بمخرجات ناجحة أيضا. سؤالك سؤال يحتاج إلى جواب دقيق، ويحتاج كذلك إلى رجوع إلى باختصار إلى مرحلة تاريخية كلش قصيرة، يعني ما راح آخذ مدة طويلة. العراق مر في مسألة التجربة الانتخابية بثلاث مراحل. الأولى منذ تأسيس الدولة العراقية وحتى 1958 حتى 2003 وحتى اليوم. المرحلة الأولى تعرفون نظام تعددي برلماني يعطي شرعيته من البرلمان إلى الحكومة، ومبني على أساس في بدايته على النضال للاستقلال ضد الحكم البريطاني، ولكن ثم بعد 45 تبدي قوانين الأحزاب، فتظهر أحزاب سياسية مثل الحزب الوطني، الاتحاد الوطني، الوطني الديمقراطي، الشعب، التحرير، الدستور الملكي إلى آخره. ثم نأتي إلى المرحلة الثانية الذي يقرر فيه الضباط الأحرار بأن يكونوا السلطة العليا للحكم في العراق، وتبدأ مرحلة أخرى هي مرحلة الانقلابات العسكرية المتتالية منذ 14 تموز 1958 مرورا بكل الأحداث الصغيرة، مثل يعني الأحداث الأقل اللي لم تنجح، مثل محاولة اغتيال عبد الكريم قاسم إلى عبد الوهاب الشواف وإلى انقلاب البعثيين وإلى آخره، لندخل إلى مرحلة يعني بعد 45 سنة من الحكم الشمولي البعيد عن الديمقراطية الذي لم تمارس فيه أفراد الشعب أو مارست بشكل جدا رمزي أي ممارسة ديمقراطية، إلى مرحلة ما بعد 2003. 2003 هي مرحلة تعددية، مرحلة فيدرالية، مرحلة اتحادية. هذه الحكومة هذه هي أسس تأسيسها اتحادية برلمانية تعددية، ومبنية على أساس الشراكة الوطنية والتوافق السياسي بين الأحزاب وبين المكونات السياسية والأحزاب السياسية. نذهب إلى هذه الانتخابات القادمة بتجربة مع تجاربنا السابقة، وفي مرحلة أخرى نذهب في مرحلة مثل ما تفضل بها الأستاذ رائد فهمي، مرحلة قد يكون التأثير الخارجي والإقليمي والمتغيرات الموجودة قد يكون لها تأثير في خلال الأشهر القادمة، ونحن لا نعرف صراحة كيف ستكون العلاقة بين الولايات أو طبيعة الاحتكاك بين الولايات المتحدة ودول جوارنا، كيف سيكون مصير مثلا الجارة سوريا، وهذه أمور مهمة من الناحية الخارجية بالتأثير على الانتخابات. داخليا وهذه مهمة في تقديري، سأبدأ من الملف الكردي. لدى الكرد موضوع المشاركة في الانتخابات هو موضوع تعزيز للشراكة الموجودة في بغداد، والشراكة في بغداد احنا كلنا نعرف بأنها مرت في مراحل جذب ويعني مرة جيدة ومرة تنسحب.
طيب دكتور،
وعليه بس خليني أقول لك
هذا سؤال بسيط بس. في هذا الأمر في مرحلة الشراكة مع بغداد ممكن أن نسهج استراتيجية جديدة للكرد للتعامل مع العرب أو مع السنة أو الشيعة في بغداد في التحالفات الانتخابية القادمة؟
نحن نلمس الآن اهتمام أكثر وتعزيز أكثر ومحاولة لتعزيز أكثر لوجود الكرد عن طريق البرلمان، لأولا تقوية هذه الشراكة ولعب دور أساسي في الحكومة وفي العملية السياسية. كذلك لا تنسى هنالك أمور أخرى دافعة، مثلا المسائل المناطق المتنازع عليها اللي أنا أسميها المناطق المتشاركة عليها، اللي لحد الآن مشاكلها صراحة
هذا عندي سؤال خاص
لم تحل. عندنا قضايا تتعلق بمسألة الموازنة والمشاكل اللي مستمرة، وعليه الأحزاب السياسية وخاصة الحزبين الرئيسيين الحزب الديمقراطي والاتحاد الوطني سيدفعون دائما في كل الانتخابات بوجود أكثر أو بمحاولة لوجود أكثر في بغداد حتى مقارنة بقبل. بالنسبة للملفات أختصر، المشاركة في توقعي على المستوى العراقي، على مستوى البلد عراقيا سيكون أكثر، وهنالك أسباب موضوعية يعني تخلينا نفكر بهذا الاتجاه. أولا، قرار التيار الصدري في رجوعه إلى العملية إن قرر خلال الشهرين القادمين، لأن رجوعه بعد غياب والطريقة التي انسحب منها إلى تأثير على تحفيز أو في مشاركة خاصة في محافظات الجنوب والوسط. أما بالنسبة وعندنا حالة ثانية أيضا ونقولها بصراحة، هي النية الواضحة للسيد دولة رئيس الوزراء في المشاركة في هذه الانتخابات وكيفية مشاركته، آلية مشاركته. وأخيراً أحب أن نقول أن الأخوة السنة كذلك عندهم رجوع إلى الانتخابات بشخص السيد الحلبوسي الذي جرح سابقاً واستفاد من هذا الملف، يعني في رجوعه بقوة. وعليه بشكل عام أتوقع المشاركة بالنسبة لإقليم كردستان ستكون أكثر من المرة السابقة، لن تكون بقدر المشاركة في انتخابات برلمان كردستان لأنه كانت 72% وحالة بارزة بسبب وجود منافسة كبيرة بين الحزبين الرئيسيين، ولكن قد تكون حدة المنافسة ومثل لأنه سؤالك كان حدة المنافسة قد تكون أقل، باعتبار أن تجربة حدة المنافسة قد يعني قد لا تنتج عن، خاصة في مسألة بغداد اللي هي الآن أكو طرح بأن تكون مواقف مشتركة في المستقبل هنالك.
شكرا جزيلا دكتور،
وهي ضرورية طبعا.
أرجع لك فيما بعد أكيد. أنتقل إلى دكتور مصطفى عياش الكوبيسي. دكتور، من أبرز القضايا المؤشرة على المشهد السياسي السني هو عدم وجود استراتيجية واضحة يعني تجمع القوى السنية التي يجمع يعني أو يصعب توحيدها في بوتقة واحدة كما فعلت القوى السياسية الشيعية في الإطار التنسيقي وشكلت حكومة، وهذا الإطار ما زال متماسك حتى اللحظة، والحكومة توصف على أنها حكومة ناجحة. وذكر دكتور آسو أنه أكو متغيرات في المشهد السني، مثلا الأنبار لم تعد هي المحافظة الوحيدة التي تقرر مصير المشهد السني السياسي، وكذلك هناك تحولات في القوى السياسية السنية والناخب السني سواء مثلا في تقدم وأحزاب أخرى. لذلك هناك من يقول أن يعني السنة في أضعف حالاتهم على اعتبار أنهم متفرقين وغير متوحدين، وهناك من يقول أن هذا التفرق هو قوة بالنسبة إلى الجانب السني وممكن أن يحصلون عليه في مكاسب عديدة وعلاقات أوسع مع الأطراف، لا سيما مع الكرد مثلا والشيعة. في وجهة نظرك ماذا تعتقد عن الخلافات السنية؟
بداية شكرا لروداو وشكرا لمركز البيان على هذه الفرصة. الوضع السني ربما يختلف عن الوضع الكردي والوضع الشيعي لعدة اعتبارات، وباعتبارنا في منتدى حوار راح أتكلم بصراحة أكثر. ربما البيت الشيعي رتب أوضاعه من التسعينات وكان يعد العدة لمرحلة ما بعد 2003. البيت الكردي أيضا رتب المشهد وكان عارف بما سيحصل. البيت السني أو القوى السنية لم تكن موجودة أصلا في مرحلة ما قبل 2003 إلا بوجود شكلي في مؤتمر لندن أو غيره. جينا إلى المشهد اليوم، احنا يمكن أكثر من دورة انتخابية. بدأوا السنة في فكرة هل نشارك بالانتخابات، لو الانتخابات حرام، لو حلال، لو يعني هذه الفترة الانتقالية شلون نتعامل وياها. ما كان اكو مشروع سني معد لمرحلة ما بعد 2003، وهذا اللي خلى حتى المحافظات السنية مرتبكة في القرار، مرتبكة في التمثيل، ربما إلى آخر دورتين انتخابية. هذا الشيء أيضا يمكن استثمروه باقي شركائنا بطريقة أو بأخرى. احنا اليوم نتكلم عن المزاج السني تحرك خلينا نقول بثقافة المكونات والهويات الفرعية في 2006 يعني بنسبة 10-15% من المشاركة، ثم تحرك وطنيا مع اياد علاوي في 2010 عسى ولعل أنه ينتج مشروع وهوية جديدة. للأسف أيضا حتى هذا المشروع لم ينجح ولم يصل السنة. اقتنعوا السنة بعد مرحلة 2010 بأنه ثقافة المكونات هي السائدة، النظام السياسي لن يسمح بخيارات أخرى، عليكم يا سنة روحوا اشتغلوا سنة وبعدين تعالوا بعد الانتخابات تحالفوا طوليا عرضيا مع من تشاءون. المرحلة اللي وصلنا لها احنا اليوم حدة الخلافات في المجتمع السني، الخلافات من تشخيص علي الوردي إلى اليوم خلافات موجودة، في البيت الشيعي خلافات، في البيت الكردي خلافات، وفي البيت السني أيضا خلافات حادة ربما يعني أعطت رسالة مزاجية للناخب السني أن ما يشارك. يمكن ذكر الدكتور رائد أنه نسبة المشاركة لا تتجاوز 20%، وأنا أقول فعلا والأكثر هذه نسبة عدم المشاركة. يعني في بغداد تشوف مثلا نسبة المشاركة في العامرية 13%، بينما مثلا تشوف نسبة المشاركة في مدينة الصدر تصل إلى 60%. ربما أيضا يعني في المحافظات في بغداد والمحافظات المشتركة المزاج السني بعدما متفاعل حيل، لأنه جزء من هذا عدم التفاعل الخلافات الموجودة فعلا بين القادة السنة، وجزء منه عدم قناعة بجدية الشركاء في منظومة شراكة حقيقية. اليوم كان الحديث السني عن الاستحقاقات السيادية، احنا اليوم وصلنا حتى الهيئات الرياضية، حتى كرة القدم والمنضدة صارت وزارة الرياضة والاتحاد العراقي لكرة القدم واللجنة الأولمبية لطرف واحد. يعني هذا الشيء شلون أقدر أشجع الناخب السني اللي هو أصلا بعد عنده يعني خلينا نقول تخوفات وبعد مو مندمج بالعملية السياسية بشكل صحيح، أنه لا تعال وشارك وأخذ استحقاقك السياسي واستحقاق مكونك. أنا متفائل رغم اللي تكلمت به، متفائل أنه صار استقرار اليوم نسبي في المجتمع السني باتجاه العملية السياسية، وصار استقرار وطني أيضا بأنه المجتمع السني مهم لاستقرار البلد. أي اضطراب لا سامح الله، أي حالة عدم استقرار في الأنبار راح كل البلد يضطرب بسببها، أي حالة ارتباك راح تكون في الموصل راح تعم على باقي المحافظات. احنا اليوم العالم قرية والعراق أيضا بلد خلينا نقول واحد يتأثر بما يجري في أي محافظة من محافظاتنا. متفائل أيضا بأن هناك جيل جديد من السنة من القيادات السنية، وربما هذا راح تشوفوه بالانتخابات وسجلوه عليه، يفكر بطريقة ثانية، لا يفكر بالاستقواء الخارجي، لا يفكر بالمال السياسي الخارجي، بل مؤمن فعلا بأنه يريد يعيش ببغداد ويعيش بأربيل ويشوف أربيل حلوة ويشوف سليمانية حلوة ويشوف بغداد حلوة، ويريد يعيش بالداخل، ما يريد يبقى مرتبط ومعلق بالخارج. هذا باختصار الجواب على السؤال الأول.
شكرا جزيلا دكتور. أنتقل إلى دكتور رافع عبد الجبار. دكتور، العملية الانتخابية في العراق، وحضرتك عضو مجلس نواب سابق ولا سيما عن كتلة كبيرة مثل التيار الصدري، وكنت أحد المفاوضين في الفرق التفاوضية، تواجه تحديات كبيرة خصوصا في الوقت الحالي، تحديات فنية متعلقة في قانون الانتخابات، في الإدارة العملية الانتخابية، تحديات سياسية تدني نسبة المشاركة، والقلق من اختلال التوازن السياسي خصوصا بعد انسحاب التيار الصدري، وكذلك يعني قلق مجتمعي ومشكلة اجتماعية متعلقة في التوتر والقلق المجتمعي من التغيير القادم الذي المنتدى خلال هذه اليومين يتحدث كثيرا عنه في العراق. ويعتقد كثير من المجتمع أنه قد تكون الانتخابات القادمة هي بوابة لهذا التغيير القادم في العراق، لذلك ما يجعل العملية في قلق كبير. في رأيك يعني فضلا عن دعوات السيد مقتدى الصدر لتحديد سجل الناخبين في محاولة مثلا للمقاطعة من جديد وتدني نسبة المشاركة كثيرا، أو العودة وما يقلق الآخرين يعني من العودة بشكل كبير، برأيك هذه التحديات أو الإشكاليات تحديات حقيقية على أرض الواقع، أم أنها هي تحديات تواجه أي عملية انتخابية ممكن تكون؟
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. أنا أشكرك على هذا السؤال. الحقيقة هو محور العنوان. الحقيقة المرحلة القادمة وانتخابات 2025 تختلف عن سابقاتها الخمسة لأسباب كثيرة، أهمها وجود تحديات داخلية، وهي مثل ما تفضلت حضرتك وجود عزوف مثل ما ذكر الدكتور مصطفى أنه هي بنسبة 20% كما هو متوقع، وهذه بحد ذاتها دليل على أكو تذمر من النظام السياسي الموجود وغير مفرح حقيقة، لأن النظام السياسي الجديد هو لا زال نظام فتي وإن كان عليه 22 سنة، لكن قياسا للمركزية اللي حكمت العراق يعتبر نظام فتي ويحتاج لبناء، وهذه مسؤولية الفاعل السياسي العراقي اليوم أنه كيف يحافظ على النظام السياسي. التحدي الآخر مثل ما ذكرت حضرتك هو القانون الانتخابي. العودة إلى سانت ليغو وزيادة النسبة إلى 1 إلى 7.7 هذا مؤشر غير جيد، يعني مثلا أنه راح تمنع فرصة المستقلين بالتصويت يعني بالترشيح كعنوان فردي، بالإضافة إلى الكتل الصغيرة والمدنية أيضا ما راح تكون مشجعة للمشاركة. هذه كلها تحديات راح تنلقي وين ترجع على العزوف. هذا يأثر علينا، ما يخلينا احتمال نرجع ل 2019 والتحديات اللي واجهت النظام السياسي واللي هي سقطت حكومة وحلت برلمان. فالمفروض اليوم الفاعل السياسي ينتبه لهذه الحقيقة، لأنه التحدي الحقيقي هو كيفية إثبات نظام وجود سياسي يعني تثبت وجوده. التحدي الأكبر في وجهة نظري هو التحدي الخارجي. تذكرت التحديات الداخلية، التحدي الخارجي التغيير اللي صار بالمنطقة من بعد 7 أكتوبر سواء في فلسطين أو في لبنان أو في تغيير النظام في سوريا، وتغيير النظام في سوريا مؤشر ما معروف أنه وين متوجه. حتى البيان اللي ألقوه قبل يومين غير مشجع، لأن كثير من مكونات الشعب السوري ما كانت موجودة، أبسط شيء قسط ما له كان وجود، وهذا مؤشر خطير قد يكون يؤدي إلى شيء. بالإضافة ما معروف شنو المرسوم لسوريا، لأن التدخل الدولي في سوريا على مستوى تركيا وأمريكا وفرنسا كلها تأييد النظام، إذن أكو شيء مرسوم. قد يكون لوجود نظام سياسي يعني نظام شرق أوسطي جديد ممكن وارد، وهذه مؤشرات كثيرة. التحدي الأكبر أنا أتوقع هو في وجود وصول ترامب للسلطة، وهذا على كل القوى السياسية أن تنتبه له، بالذات النظام السياسي العراقي، لأنه اليوم النظام السياسي العراقي مع هذه الانتخابات أمام تحدي هو إثبات النظام السياسي واستمراريته. وجود ترامب أحدث قلق ليس على مستوى المنطقة فقط، لا على مستوى العالم، لأنه الأحداث اللي وصوله والخطابات اللي بداها لم تحدث في العلاقات الدولية على مستوى 85 عام، يعني من الحرب العالمية الثانية ولغاية اليوم. يطاعي بضم كندا، يداعي ضم جزر كرينلاند التابعة الدنمارك، يداعي ببنما، يصعد فوق خليج المكسيك ويوقع عليه أنه خليج أمريكا. والتحدي الأكبر في توجهه هو فيما يحدث في تصفية قضية أوكرانيا، اللي أتوقع هي الاتحاد الأوروبي راح يكون في قلق من هذا الوضع، قد يكون يتفكك، لأنه عقد صفقة مع بوتين على حل قضية أوكرانيا مؤشر خطير.
طيب
هذه كل التحديات أستاذنا العزيز. أتوقع المفروض الفاعل السياسي العراقي يحسب حسابه بالانتخابات القادمة لوصول حكومة قادرة على التفاعل مع هذا المنهج.
طيب
السياسة الخارجية السابقة المفروض تتغير في التعامل مع الملف الدولي.
طيب دكتور، في الحديث عن الفاعل السياسي تتجه الأنظار نحو الحنان، هل سيعود التيار الصدري للمشهد وللانتخابات القادمة أم لا؟ وإذا يعود هل سيعود منفردا وبنفس الاستراتيجية التي كانت في 2021 أم سنشهد استراتيجية جديدة؟ لا سيما أكو طرف شيعي قوي جدا دائما ما يقول أن يدي ممدودة إلى التيار الصدري وهو السيد المالكي.
نعم.
فممكن أن نشهد هذا التحالف يكون؟
يعني هو موضوع التيار الصدري ممكن أختصر لك بجملة واحدة أقولها بالأخير مو بالبداية، لكن أستطرد لك الحراك السياسي الشيعي أو العفو التيار الصدري من بداية الانتخاب، من بداية النظام السياسي ولحد الآن. يعني احنا مثل ما عبر عنها السيد الشهيد رحمة الله على روحه قدست نفسه الزكية، كن فيهم ولا تكن منهم. يعني هو مارس المعارضة الإيجابية منذ أول دورة. بالدورة الأولى وقف ضد اتفاقية الإطار الاستراتيجي مع أمريكا وصوت عنه، يمكن الكتلة الوحيدة اللي وقفت بهذا الموقف، وأحرج الكتل السياسية الباقية بما فيها الكتل الشيعية. بالدورة الثانية أيضا إذا كان موقف كان ضمن النظام السياسي وكان ضمن الحكومة، لكن في نفس الوقت له موقف خاص به، يعني وقف في ضد محاولة سحب الثقة في 2012 واللي حدث في أربيل، اتفاقيات كثيرة منها، في وقوفه ضد اتفاقية خور عبد الله 2013. نعم كانت معنا بعض الشخصيات لكن بعنوانها الشخصي وليس بعنوان الكتل، الكتله الوحيده والدليل انه اليوم اتفاقيه خور عبد الله العراقي يعاني من عدوى وما يعرف شلون يعالجها. رغم ذلك طلعت المحكمه الاتحاديه بانه كانت ضد الشروط اللي ناص عليها الدستور. 2018 ذهب اكثر، لان حس التوافقيه اللي قادت العراق لا تصل الى نتيجه انه تبدي دوله مكونات، نعم، لكن ليس دوله مؤسسات.
دكتور في دقيقتين
راح اوصل لك النتيجه. هذا كررها بال 2021 ومحاولته من خلال تشكيل تحالف انقاذ وطن، لان حس بان الدوله العراقيه بدات نتيجه السياسه التوافقيه بدات تتجه اتجاه اخر غير قادره على ابقاء الدوله بما هي دوله العراق، وانما دوله مكونات، وهذا مؤشر خطير لهذا السبب. لكن رغم ذلك ما قدر يحقق الاغلبيه مع اتفاقيه مع الحزب الديمقراطي ومع تقدم، فبالنتيجه ما قدر يحققها على اساس قرار المحكمه الاتحاديه اللي هو كان غير منصف حقيقه. نحن معروف انه التصويت على الحكومه يكون بالاغلبيه المطلقه وليس بالثلثين بالحضور. اما بالنسبه لحضور التيار الصدري ودعوته الى تجديد البطاقه الانتخابيه لا تعني انه سيشترك، وكان تعبير واضح انه حدثوا البطاقه لان التحديات كبيره وعن الشعب العراقي كله يعبر رايه، لكن لحد الان لم يبين موقفه. هل سيعيد اشتراك بالانتخاب ام بعده؟ هذا اعتقد سابق لاوان.
شكرا جزيلا دكتور آسو، ارجع لك في هذا السؤال. سمعنا السيد المشهداني يوم امس تكلم عن طبخه جديده الى قانون الانتخابات ويجري التحضير عليها. هل سيكون للكرد رأي في هذا القانون ورأي واضح وصريح؟ وهل ستكون مطالب الأكراد في العراق دائرة انتخابية واحدة خصوصا في المناطق المتنازع عليها في ضمن المادة 140؟ ستكون هناك استراتيجية لهذا الموضوع في 5 دقائق؟
يعني طبعا كل ما يقال عن يعني حاليا عن تلبلب قانون انتخابي جديد هو يعني بعد في ضوء أو في مرحلة المناقشة بين الأحزاب والجهات السياسية. للاتفاق على قانون، وجدا صعب أن تأتي إلى قانون أو تخرج بقانون يكون من مصلحة الجميع، هذا جدا صعب. لكن من الضروري أن يؤخذ بنظر الأحزاب الكردية، التيار الصدري، الإطار التنسيقي، الأحزاب السنية، للوصول إلى نوع من قانون يعني يكون عليه أقل عدد أو أقل نسبة من المعارضة وأكبر نسبة من الرضا أو التأييد. فمسألة طبعا الواضح أنه أكو تخوف من القانون المناطق المتعددة، وكذلك الآن من سانت ليغو، ودي يدورون على نوع من القانون الذي يمزج بين الاثنين. المهم أنه لحد الآن الحمد لله يعني انتخابات تجري في وقتها، المعلن عنها هو في شهر 10 أو 11، والأهم أنه الجهات ملتزمة بهذه الانتخابات، لأنه هذا جزء كبير من استمرار العملية الديمقراطية اللي أن تجري انتخابات بشكل سلس في وقتها، هذا جدا مهم. بالنسبة لجنابك تفضلت في سؤالك تصور عن المناطق المتنازعة، أنا باعتقادي أنه المناطق المتنازعة مثل ما قلت مسألة الشراكة، الكرد هم شريك أساسي للدولة العراقية، يعني هم جزء مؤسس للدولة العراقية. الكرد كانوا عندهم 17 نائب في المجلس التأسيسي عام 1925 من أصل 85. الكرد كانوا جزء من الدفاع، كانوا جزء من الشراكة، كانوا جزء من كتابة الدستور، كانوا جزء من القتال ضد داعش. وعليه أنا دا أشوف أنه أكو حرص أكثر بالتواجد في بغداد بشكل قوي لكي يتم تثبيت أو تعزيز الشراكة الأساسية الحقيقية في بغداد، وذكرها البارحة السيد نشرفان البارزاني. وكذلك الموضوع اللي يتعلق بالرواتب الموظفين، وكذلك اللي نتمنى كلها أن تنحل عن طريق تواجد فعلي وحوار فعلي بين كل الجهات.
شكرا جزيلا دكتور مصطفى. تكلمت عن التحالفات القادمة، ما قدرت أسألك قبل قليل كيف ممكن أن نفهم التحالفات؟ هل سنرى تحالف أو تحالفين كبيرة؟ وهناك جزء من القوى السياسية السنية كانت ضد مطالب الإخوان الأكراد في تعديل قانون الملكية الأراضي، فهذا هل سيؤثر أيضا على تحالفاتهم القادمة؟ ممكن أن نشهد تأثير في التحالفات؟
بالبداية اسمح لي
في 5 دقائق.
في 5 دقائق. يمكن الحديث كان الدكتور رائد على الموضوع الطائفي، وعلى أنا يمكن أشهد الدكتور المفكر عبد الحسين شعبان أول من اقترح قانون تجريم الطائفية بال2005. لكن اليوم ثقافة يعني الهويات الفرعية وثقافة المكونات هي اللي سادت في النظام السياسي. احنا اليوم كمكون سني أعتقد راح تكون هناك 3 قوائم تقليدية اللي هي موجودة أصلا، ربما أكو 50% من ثقلها السابق راح يختفي، وربما تشكل يعني جبهة جديدة لقوى جديدة، أحزاب ناشئة، قبائل كبيرة لحصد يعني العدد الأكبر من المقاعد. غياب الجمهور السني عن الانتخابات يفقد الجمهور السني في كل انتخابات ما لا يقل عن 20 مقعدا، خصوصا في المحافظات المشتركة، وهذا طبعا يعني بالأرقام. العمل الجديد على فكرة 70-80% من المجتمع السني الزعلان عن العملية السياسية. العمل اليوم على إقناع 80% من الجمهور السني على المشاركة والتفاعل مع الدولة، مع المجتمع، مع العملية السياسية، لإنتاج وجوه جديدة، لإنتاج برامج جديدة. نفضل أن يكون السباق ليس بلغة السلاح والمال السياسي وغيرها. نتمنى أن نشاهد الدورة القادمة يكون هناك سباق برامج، سباق أفكار، سباق مشاريع. الجيل الجديد من الشباب السنة ربما راح يحققون مفاجأة في الانتخابات القادمة.
شكرا جزيلا دكتور مصطفى. أرجع لك سيد رائد. دائما ما يشكل على اليسار أنه يغيب قبل وخلال وبعد الانتخابات. هل المشكلة في الانتخابات، في قانونها، في النظام السياسي؟ واليسار في هذه الانتخابات هل سيكون حاضر منذ البداية إلى النهاية؟
احنا وجهتنا أن نشارك بالانتخابات، يعني الوجهة مالتنا، ولكن أشير إلى نقطة تفضل بها الأخ عياش الآن، أنه موضوع البرامج. نحن كقوى يسارية مدنية نعمل على أساس مشروع برنامج، والبرنامج اللي نعمله هو ذو طابع وطني وهو يدعو للتغيير، وهي المعادلة مهمة جدا. التحديات اللي ذكرت هي تحديات البلد، هي تحديات الوطن، وبالتالي ينبغي أي مشروع، لازم نتحدث مشروع، لازم يكون البعد الوطني حاضر. لا تلاحظ أنه على الأسف معظم القوى السياسية اليوم تتحدث عن مشروع مكوناتي غايب. إذا المشروع الوطني هو يستمد من المشروع المكوناتي، في حين هو المفروض العكس. فإحنا مشروعنا ذو بعد وطني وأيضا ذو بعد تغييري، والوطني لا يعني إعادة تكريس وإعادة إنتاج النظام السياسي كما هو. يبدو أن كل القوى تنظر للانتخابات هو تجميع أصوات. نعم هذا جزء منها، ولكن عندما البلد يعاني من مشاكل كبيرة لازم نتحدث، والمفروض الانتخابات تكون مادة كيف نواجه التحديات هذه، وما هي كيف تتصارع وجهات النظر. هل ما هو مطروح الآن القوى المختلفة تطرح هيك برنامج؟ تطرح هيك الرؤى؟ أنت تطرح مجرد اصطفافات سياسية وهذا بشأن تحالفات. فإحنا نعتقد بصراحة، إحنا نعتقد الوضع بالمنطقة بخطورة، بعدم يقين كثير، وعدم التنكر. أنا سمعت السيد رئيس البرلمان حكي وكأن الأمور ماشية عدل وإحنا بمعزل وإحنا بمنأى ومجرد مشاكل كمية ونوعية منا. لا حتى هذا الاستقرار اللي نتحدث عنه هو استقرار نسبي، وحتى المشاكل الاقتصادية قد تكبر. فلذلك أقول إنه إحنا حاضرين ندعو إلى أن يصير تبصر بحقيقة المشاكل الكبرى، وأن يتم إدراك أن هناك حاجة للتغيير. هسه سمي إصلاح عميق، سمي تغيير، إصلاح. الآن ماكو شيء إدراك.
تمام.
أنا بكمل. أخير شيء إحنا أقول نتحالف القوى المدنية، القانون مناسب لها، الخطاب الطائفي والمكونات ما يناسبها.
شكرا جزيلا سيد رائد. دكتور رافع، في حال عودة التيار الصدري هل سنشهد تحالف صدري كردي كما حصل في 2021؟ وفي حال لم يعود التيار الصدري ما هي الرسالة إلى الفاعل السياسي الموجود حاليا؟ في 3 دقائق.
هواية 3 دقائق.
هواية؟ خلص.
لأن هو المبدأ أساساً أنت ما تقدر تحكي عن تحالفات إذا ما تسبقها هل تشترك أو ما تشترك. الاشتراك لحد الآن لم يحدد ولم يعلن عنه. نعم صار دعوة باعتبار اليوم القواعد الصدرية هي جزء من الشعب العراقي، والتحديات القادمة هي مسؤوليته، فلا بد أن تكون له بصمة. الانتخابات القادمة مثل ما قلت تحتاج أن نتعامل مع التحدي الخارجي أكثر ما تتعامل مع التحدي الداخلي. لكن عندما يتحدد مشاركته ذاك وقت نتحدث عن التحالفات الأخرى الباقية. شكرا جزيلا.
شكرا جزيلا ضيوفي الأعزاء، شكرا جزيلا لكم على هذه الآراء وهذه المناقشات القيمة. شكرا جزيلا للحضور الكريم، ونتمنى لكم أوقات سعيدة في ملتقى روداو. شكرا جزيلا.